Very good afternoon. Welcome back to the BBC Election Centre. All the results are in. All 650 results in this UK general election of 2015 are in. And let's show you exactly where we are now with all seats accounted for. And we have a Conservative majority of 12. 326 was the finishing line, 331 seats to the Conservatives, 232 to Labour. Those are the final figures with all seats declared. A Conservative majority against all the predictions and all the forecasts. A result that no one really had predicted. David Cameron already back in Downing Street, having seen the Queen, having had the audience with the Queen at around lunchtime. Let me just take you through the precise figures so that we've got all parties accounted for, not just Conservative and Labour, which I've just shown you. And Ed Miliband, the Labour leader, already resigned this afternoon. The SNP in Scotland, this is really one of the other massive stories of the past 24 hours. Huge gains, sweeping gains right across Scotland. 56 out of 59 seats have gone to the Scottish National Party, and most of those at Labour's expense. The Lib Dems, dreadful night, losing 49 seats. It was 48, but now with St Ives it's 49. They're just on 8 seats in this new parliament. Nick Clegg is also resigning as leader. The DUP on 8, and the others on 15. So if we just scroll through the others very quickly and just see what's there for us, we have Sinn Féin on 4. They lost 1 in Fermanagh and South Tyrone. We also have Plaid Cymru on 3. No gains for them, and that'll be a disappointment for them because they had a pretty high-profile campaign. The SDLP in Northern Ireland on 3. No change there. All the talk of them having some kind of alliance with Labour, well, that's all gone with this result. And the Ulster Unionists, 2. They've gained 2. Let's go straight to Downing Street. Norman Smith, our assistant political editor, is there. And Norman, your thoughts this afternoon, given that we're not just talking now, of course, about the result, which I've just recapped. We're talking about what happens next, not least the decisions being made in the House behind you.
And we will get, I think, some clear decisions about some of the key cabinet posts within the next hour or so. And I suppose critical to that is who is going to be responsible for cutting a new deal with Europe. Who is going to be Foreign Secretary? Who is going to be the person who's going to have to carry out those absolutely pivotal negotiations? There has been speculation about whether the Prime Minister might seek to move the Chancellor there to have his most trusted ally involved in those absolutely critical negotiations. The difficulty with that, of course, is because the economy is so central to British politics. We still face one of the largest deficits in the Western world. Could he really afford to pull him out of, if you like, the front line of British politics at the Treasury? Who then might do it? Philip Hammond, of course, has the credentials as a Eurosceptic to drive a very hard bargain indeed. But might Mr Cameron want someone different in that post? Now, we're told we should expect names in about an hour's time. I expect we will get those from Twitter. So if you want to save yourself the pain of having to listen to the likes of me, if you follow the Prime Minister on Twitter, you might get the first indication there.
Norman, thanks very much. And just a quick thought, Norman, as well on the Lib Dems and on Labour this afternoon, given the fact that both leaders are stepping down. What are you picking up from those two parties in terms of the way they're trying to look ahead to the next few months?
Well, it seems to me they face an awful pressure to act immediately, to start conducting a race straight away. And we already know there are sort of names of runners and riders. But at the same time, such was the scale of their defeat, an absolutely shattering, pulverising defeat, in particular for the Liberal Democrats, but also for the Labour Party. They have lost their Scottish heartland. They've been rebuffed by Middle England. They've seen some of their biggest names culled. Only in London did they have a modicum of success. They have to question where they go now and what they are about. And that would seem to me to require a fairly fundamental reappraisal of what they do next before they stampede into a leadership election. But there will be huge pressure because Ed Miliband is standing down. Clearly they will want someone in position to take on David Cameron. But it seems to me the task both those parties now face are so gargantuan, it would be a very, very rash move simply to think you could put in place a new leader and you're halfway to solving your problems.
Norman, we'll talk to you later. Thanks very much, especially when those names come through. Back here, Joe Coburn, let's talk a little bit about Europe before we go to talk to Katya Adler, our Europe editor, because you have a couple of things on social media to show us which will help us in the European talk.
Well, of course, there is reaction from abroad, and David Cameron will be receiving calls all the time from other world leaders. Let's take a look at this. It's actually come from the Élysée Palace. It's best wishes from François Hollande, the French president, congratulating him on his success. But actually, just alongside that, if we look at this tweet from Le Monde, the front page, we can see the picture here, first of all. There it is. You can see the Camerons there. Success. But if we go back to what it actually says underneath, UK triumph for Cameron, unease for Europe. And that may actually spell out what is to come in terms of Europe's reaction, the leaders' reaction there, about what will happen between now and that EU referendum that David Cameron pretty well made a red line if he wasn't a majority government.
UK to leave the EU, and most of them don't. They have to now deal seriously with David Cameron in the way they didn't have to before the election. Very important.
Let's go straight to Brussels, and Katya Adler is there, our Europe editor. Thoughts there, Katya, given that Le Monde is talking about worry or unease, what is your sense of things there?
Well, it sums up the mood, certainly. I mean, the words political earthquake have today been translated into numerous European languages as the British election has made front-page news. But yes, there is a lot of concern outside the UK. This election has focused minds on one thing to do with the UK, and that is Britain renegotiating its membership of the European Union. Now, we heard today from the guardian of the EU treaties that David Cameron has said he wants to change. Jean-Claude Juncker said he will be listening to whatever proposals Britain comes up with. But at the end of the day, it's not up to the EU institutions, it's up to EU countries if there is going to be any change at all. And the countdown starts now. David Cameron says he wants to hold a referendum in 2017. Brussels is hardly known for quick decision-making. You've got the European leaders all coming here to Brussels next month, and they will be expecting to hear from David Cameron. You can expect quite some flexibility, actually. There are very few EU countries that want Britain and its burgeoning economy to leave the fold. But, of course, there are those federalists. They worry that any call from Britain for less Brussels might be echoed then in other European countries, leading perhaps to the unravelling of the EU as we know it, or as they dream that it could or should be.
Isn't it the case, Katya, that when Mr Juncker talked, I think it was 2 weeks ago maybe, and I think it was to you, he talked about, you know, minor changes to treaties. I mean, tinkering, if you like, and that was fine, yes, he said, but, you know, nothing bigger than that, nothing major, nothing significant. So what hope does David Cameron have that he's going to move in any sense in that way?
I think he can feel pretty confident. I mean, the fact that Jean-Claude Juncker spoke to me about those potential minor changes to treaties just before the British election shows that there really is some flexibility here. There's really been a change in the mood music. As I said, there is maybe an irritation with Britain's pick-and-mix attitude, as it's known here, choosing to be out of the euro but in with other things. But at the end of the day, Britain has an extremely strong economy. It has that close relationship with the United States. It's very influential still in foreign policy on the world stage, and other EU countries do not want to lose it. How far will they go? Well, really, you know, there's going to be a lot of posturing, there's going to be a lot of arguing, and everything at the moment really will be on the table. Can treaties be fundamentally changed? Will they be tinkered with? Or are there ways to sort of work within the existing treaties full stop without changing anything? Of course, that's where the European partners will start with, to see whether it can be possible to go forward without changing anything, particularly because of those worries that this could lead for call for treaty change and a new relationship with Europe in other countries. I'm talking particularly about France here, worried about the Eurosceptic National Front, for example, Hungary as well, the Netherlands. They have very strong Eurosceptic countries. So thinking about Britain and its renegotiations will make them worry about their own populations back at home.
Katya, for now, thanks very much. Katya Adler, our Europe editor there in Brussels. We've been joined in the studio by Labour's Charles Clarke, former Home Secretary. Charles, nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Before we come to you to talk about Labour and indeed the wider picture, Jeremy has the final House of Commons make-up for us, which I think is important at this point. So let's put all of our figures into the system. Now that we don't need to wait for any more results, they're all in, 650 of them, and Jeremy can give us the definitive picture.
Indeed I can. So here we are. No more talk of exit polls and forecasts. We have reality now, albeit in a virtual kind of way, here inside our own House of Commons. This is the result. The last came in, the receipt has just come in, and as you've been discussing, almost symbolically, it's a Conservative gain from the very troubled Liberal Democrats. That's been a pattern of the night. So let's have a look here. We have the Conservative number for you, the final result. 331 seats, a majority of 12, and there is David Cameron on the front bench, returned as Prime Minister. And worth bearing in mind, down here was the finishing line, 326. You have to get over that to have an overall majority in the House of Commons. In the last election, 2010, they were stuck back here. They had to go into coalition with the Liberal Democrats. This time, against all the odds, against all the pundits, all the predictions, they've gone past it. They have confounded every prediction and won outright. To the other parties, success and failure on the opposition benches. A disastrous night for Labour. 232 seats and much soul-searching to come. Labour going down, back to a position before Gordon Brown's defeat 5 years ago, and Ed Miliband now gone as leader. The success story on the opposition benches, though, is simply stratospheric. Here we have the final SNP figure, confirmed it a while back, but let's be clear, 56 MPs, quite extraordinary. Alex Salmond of the SNP saying the Scottish lion has roared, so it has. They've gone up 50 seats, only 6 in 2010. The Liberal Democrats, almost the mirror situation, the reverse. Here they are, down to 8. They had 57 at the last general election. And here is Mr Clegg, who's also going as leader. 3 leaders gone in a single day. When did that last ever happen in British politics? And a very, very chastening result for him. The penalty of being in coalition with the Conservatives. It's cost them dear. The other parties, let's just quickly show you them. Plaid Cymru still on 3, the Greens still on 1 in Brighton. UKIP getting their first MP at a general election. It's Douglas Carswell in Clacton, who's been re-elected after that by-election. And the others, 18 in Northern Ireland, including 2 Ulster Unionist MPs, new MPs, meaning that they are back in the game at Westminster. So that is now after, I won't even try and calculate, what is it, 16 hours, 17 hours since we first saw the exit poll, and we really didn't believe it. Here it is. It's an even more dramatic result than we were predicting. It's an outright win for the Conservatives, with 331 seats returned to the government benches. Hugh.
Jeremy, thanks very much. So within that complete picture that Jeremy has just given us, clearly there is a story to be looked at in terms of what went wrong for Labour, not least in some of those seats in the Midlands and the battlegrounds where they needed to take seats off the Conservatives. So before we talk to Charles about that, let's go over to Emily.
Jeremy's just brought us the conclusion of the night. I'm going to show you some of the steps of the journey which make sense of how we've got to where we've got to. These are East Midlands marginals, Conservative Labour battlegrounds, if you like. Some of these should have been incredibly easy for Labour to pick up on a good night. This is Sherwood. It was the most vulnerable Conservative seat in the East Midlands, a majority of just over 200. But you can see what's happened here. Conservatives on 45 to Labour's 36%. And when you look at the change overnight, you see that the Conservatives are actually gaining here. The swing is towards the Conservatives, away from Labour, and that's why this is not shifting to red. It's exactly the same sort of pattern in Broxtowe. Anna Soubry, Defence Minister, many expected to see her go. They thought she would be one of the first scalps, if you like, if Labour were having a good night and the Conservatives were suffering. But she's here. Look also at this UKIP result. They are moving into 3rd place now. They become the second party of opposition. Amber Valley, you might remember Nigel Mills caught playing Candy Crush on his laptop in the middle of the House of Commons. That didn't do him any harm. He's been returned here on a 4,000 majority. UKIP again in 3rd place, Labour taking the hit there. One more, I could go on. Erewash, same sort of story. This is the one I'm trying to get to. Corby, which looks like a Conservative hold. It is if you go back to 2010. But you'll remember Louise Mensch left here. There was a by-election won by Labour. So in many ways, the Conservatives can start to see this sort of seat as a coming back. If I show you the swing, it will do something interesting. It's a 0.4% swing towards the Conservatives. So these are the areas that Labour really wanted to be taking. They should have been pretty easy pickings, and they haven't even made those first steps on the journey.
Interesting. Emily, thanks very much. Charles, welcome.
Hello.
Well, for you, we've had Jim Murphy's analysis of what went wrong, delivered this morning at breakfast time, that Labour had lost touch in many areas and simply hadn't been sharp enough to recognise what was going on in Scotland. That was the context there. There was no such analysis from Ed Miliband in his speech today. What's your analysis of why that happened?
I think the central reason, as in 2010, was that the core of our message was vote for us because we're not the Conservatives. I think people are fed up with that. They don't want that. They don't like the rat-a-tat that goes on in that way. We need, as an opposition party, to say what we want to see, the kind of society we want to build, in a very coherent way. And I don't think we were able to do that this time. I don't think it was just about Ed Miliband, just as I don't think 2010 was just about Gordon Brown. It was that we hadn't gone through the thought process of, A, why did we lose? B, how do we oppose? That's a much more difficult problem than it appears, and it will be in this Parliament more difficult than it was in the last. And thirdly, how do we win? They seem obvious questions, but actually it's very difficult. There was a debate going on in the whole of this Parliament about the so-called 35% strategy, which I've always thought is a load of nonsense, but basically you get out your 35%. Actually, you can't govern Britain unless you're talking to all of the people of the country, understanding what their concerns are, putting forward not just policies, but coherent approaches to government, if I can put it forward like that, whether it's in education, health, or whatever. So if you take Ed's quite reasonable strategy of one nation, well, the question was then, what did a one-nation health service look like? What did a one-nation education system look like? And we didn't follow up on those kinds of things to produce coherence for the idea. You could say the same about the predator capitalism point. What did this really mean when you took it much more widely? And I think that's our challenge. And as Emily's just described, the depth of the problem here is immense. We've got less MPs in Parliament, Labour, than in any election since 1945, other than 1983 and 1987. This is, in fact, for Labour, almost an exact rerun of 1987, almost exactly the same number of seats. We were 229 then, it's 232 here. We took 10 years after that to get into office. It required thinking how to win the kinds of seats that Emily was just describing to us, and gradually, through part of the Neil Kinnock years, then the Tony Blair years, we gradually started winning difficult seats like that over a long period of time. Strong local government, strong candidates, talking to people more widely. It's a long and difficult process. And I'm afraid the meaning of last night is we've got to go right back to that, think those questions through, think how we relate to people, and let's not dismiss it as just saying we had the wrong leader and get in another leader and that sorts it. I mean, we do need a better leader. I don't think this leader was very good, but that's not the core of the problem. The core of the problem is thinking through who we are, what we're about, what we're trying to achieve.
Do you think there's a problem, Charles, in Labour's attitude to the state? Do you think you're still too statist, too 1940s, too 1950s
Completely.
as a party?
There was a very big difference within the new Labour government. I always used to describe it like this. Gordon Brown and his colleagues, who really became the leadership of Labour at this period, were in favour of what I used to call Webbite Fabian socialism, a strong central state where you could pull a lever, press a button in London, and things would change in Hartlepool. Tony Blair was, and I associated myself with the Tony approach, was kind of local entrepreneurship. So it's foundation schools, foundation hospitals, academy schools and so on, trying to free up local institutions of the state rather than saying you all controlled it all from the centre. And there was a dividing line, you're very familiar with it because you studied it very closely, which ran through that government and weakened us immensely. We're not clear now where we are on all these things. Are academies completely anathema? Are we in fact saying we should run everything from the central state, etc., etc., etc.? And we need to have a coherence about what we're saying in all of these areas.
And similarly, Charles Clarke, wealth creators, a sense that Labour has not really been interested in people employing other people, wealth creators, making profits, that was somehow beyond the pale.
Of course, completely. Well, I mean, again, that's a change over the recent period. Funnily enough, I think that was a division, actually, between Ed Balls and Ed Miliband. Ed Balls, I think, understood and understands much more the wealth creation point. He understands the city and all of that, and believes, and he showed it when he was in government with Gordon Brown in the Treasury, that you have to work with the wealth creators. Now, there's lots of arguments about how far does it go, what kind of legislation do you have, and so on. But in principle, he 100% accepts that, in my opinion. I don't think Ed Miliband ever did.
Can I just ask about Scotland? I mean, what was your view, having looked at the results, wipe out pretty well in Scotland? Do you think that actually the Labour campaign, to some extent, demonised the SNP in a way that obviously completely backfired?
It did. Labour in Scotland has been a very, very difficult area over the whole time I've been involved in politics. Many Scottish Labour people didn't welcome people from the rest of the UK going to Scotland to participate in conferences, debates, even discussing things like the kind of issues Andrew was just raising about how you ran Scottish schools or the Scottish Health Service was almost out of the question. And so we went along in a very complacent way, running our Scottish Labour Party in our way for ourselves, for our own people, as we saw it, the people working for the health service, the education service or whatever, not reaching out into the wider community. Now, I don't say we got it right in England. I'm certainly not saying England's the answer, Scotland isn't. I could give a lot of country examples where Scotland's done better than England. But I do think that we just hadn't thought about it. And so the SNP came along in a very attractive way. I thought Nicola Sturgeon ran an excellent campaign. It's a free hit we gave them, really. We didn't contest them. I thought we made a big mistake in the campaign, not at the very beginning, at that first debate of the Seven, challenging Nicola Sturgeon to say, would she accept that the referendum result was a referendum result for a generation, and therefore she would not include it in the manifesto for the 2016. It would not be another question if the EU referendum had been lost or whatever. We just gave her a free hit, and she just went for it, because she's a talented politician and did well.
Do you think those Scottish Labour politicians, I mean, there's always been criticism that so many Scottish Labour politicians, if you look back to the Gordon Brown, the John Reid sort of era, all came down to Westminster. They want to have to stay in Scotland. They'll have to rebuild from there, won't they? The Jim Murphys, even though they've lost their seats, Douglas Alexander's, etc.
I think it's even more than that. We've got the Scottish Parliament elections next year, very quickly, and one of the issues about the length of the election is a problem because the Labour needs to get its act together for that and also for the London and Welsh elections in a year's time. I think there's a real question whether we should simply say right now the Scottish Labour Party is an independent force. It has its own constitution, its own operations. They're like the SDLP in Northern Ireland, a fraternal party, to use that old-fashioned word, but we're not trying to tie it together. And the Scottish leaders, people like Jim, and fortunately, we still have a large number of very talented Scottish Labour leaders.
That's where it all started, of course, with the ILP back in 1914, 1920.
And the first few leaders of the Labour Party nationally, from Keir Hardie himself, were all Scottish.
And to some extent, Jim Murphy was hinting that there needed to be some sort of separation.
But it's something that we meaning Labour, have to grip, a nettle we have to grasp pretty damn quick. We've got to do it really now, because we've only got a year till the Scottish elections. Who's going to write that manifesto? Where is it? And the other nettle, which is very difficult, is who's paying for Scotland. I was always in favour of abolishing the Barnett formula. That was always seen as a provocation. But the fact is that I don't think English people will indefinitely accept a state of affairs of money going to Scotland, and I don't think Nicola Sturgeon is ready to... She's not really wanting fiscal independence.
Well, not at the moment.
Well, because she knows it'll cost her a lot of money. I mean, the IFS says 7.6 billion, whatever figure you come up with. But actually, they don't really want it. There's a fundamental dishonesty about finance, which has to be sorted out very, very quickly indeed.
Let's just underline what's happened to Labour in Scotland, because it's a good moment to do that. And I think Jeremy's got another sort of set of stats for us, I suppose, which will underline for us exactly what's going on there in Scotland with Labour. Jeremy?
Yes. Let me show you something here in the lobby of the House of Commons, the members' lobby. And we'll have a look at Labour's vote in Scotland. So just follow me over here. And I'm going to show you what's happened to Labour. But bear with me, because we're going to do a bit of history here. So we're going to go back to 1918 and age-old Labour leader William Adamson. He was actually, this is right at the birth of Labour. This guy was Scottish. He was buried in Dunfermline, and his share of the vote was 24.2%. So Labour not doing so well, but very much in the early days of the party. This is really interesting as we just follow them right through to the present day. So there we have Mr. Adamson. And up next we have 1931, Ramsay MacDonald, checkered history in the Labour Party, 32%. You could see them building here in Scotland. These are all the Scottish share of the vote in general elections. Let's bring on the next one here. And you could see 1945, and that is Clement Attlee. And again, building here, 47.9%. Who's next? Let's have a look. OK, it's Wilson. It's 66. I think they had around 48 out of 73 seats in 1966, 49%. Let's just dwell on this. Nearly 50%. That's nearly what the SNP got in the election in the last 24 hours. On we go. So think of Wilson here. And now 83 in the famous manifesto, which was the longest suicide note in history, and a terrible, terrible time for Labour. 35.1% in Scotland. So coming down off those highs with Wilson, coming down and then going up again. Let's have a look here. Nearly at the present day. Here we've got Gordon Brown, 42%. So re-establishing themselves in Scotland, 42% in 2010. OK, one more for you. So we've got those figures, and you sense here with Gordon Brown, you've got a stable Scottish vote in the 40s. They've been through the Michael Foot period. They've built, they've established themselves. Now look at what's happened. Ed Miliband here on 24% in 2015. 24%. Now, to find 24% or anything like it in this history of Labour's vote in Scotland, where do we have to go? I have to take you all the way back to the beginning. You have to go right back to the very obscure Mr. Adamson here, and his great mitigation is that he was operating right at the very start of the Labour Party when they scored this 24%. After all this time, here we are, 100 years on, they're back where they started in Scotland. That is devastating news for Labour, devastating news for Labour in Scotland especially. Hugh.
Jeremy, thanks very much. And Andy Marr was looking at those figures with some interest, Andy.
I thought, with one exception, which was that we misspelt Attlee, as in Clement Attlee. That was the standout greatest graphic extravaganza. You misspelled Attlee. But it was, what a really, really interesting graphic that was.
Sorry, was it 3 E's? I didn't see.
No, A-T-L-E-E. You said double T.
Double T.
I think in fairness, the eagle-eyed Charles Clarke had spotted it equally quickly.
We spelled foot correctly.
Also, Mr. Adamson, who was being talked down, had the biggest ever swing to Labour of any Labour leader, 14.4% in 1918.
Okay.
Bigger than Attlee.
We're going to try... Can we talk to Andrew George, who lost his seat in St Ives? Because I think we can join him now, I think, yes? Mr George, thanks very much for joining us. And commiserations to you, the last result to come in today. What are your thoughts on what happened to the Lib Dems overnight, including with you?
I think that as a country, we're not used to coalition politics. And I mean, as I think many knew, complained about us jumping in too deeply into coalition and the risk of us becoming toxified by the Conservative brand, and that appears to be what has happened. I mean, I think that, you know, cooperation between parties rather than tediously re-rehearsing the arguments between them is something which actually the public like to see politicians doing, but unfortunately when they call for such things, when it comes to actually doing it, they respond by voting the smaller party out of office, more or less. And so I think we need to learn lessons from this, regroup, and build back, if you like, the liberal. You know, the liberal priorities of this country, because they clearly will be missing from the House of Commons with only 8 members of Parliament.
As you were campaigning, Mr George, what were people telling you in St Ives? Why were they expressing resistance? What examples of policy or indeed conduct were they giving you for not voting for you?
I mean, the general theme is, of course, you know, the majority of people across West Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly are not Conservative, and they share, if you like, a collective view that we need more progressive politics in this country. But unfortunately, although the differences between, for example, myself and the Green Party and the Labour candidate weren't that great in reality, you know, because of course we had all of those parties standing, it meant that we had a fractured anti-Conservative vote, and a lot of electors locally were saying, well, look, I voted for you to keep the Tories out, and look, you went and put them in. And so a lot of those people, in sufficient numbers, it's still a marginal seat, sufficient numbers voted for either Green or Labour or spoilt their ballot papers, and so you've ended up with a Conservative a victory, which I'm sure the Tories are delighted with. But I think that the majority of people actually share, if you like, a progressive consensus.
Andy Marr has a question for you.
I was just going to ask Mr. George what you actually mean by liberal values, because if liberal values mean a suspicion of the big state, there are plenty of liberal Tories. If liberal values mean the belief that people's private lives should be, by and large, up to them, then again, there are plenty of liberal Tories. By liberal values, do you really mean left-of-centre values?
I think you're confusing liberal and libertarian. I think it's a common
Liberal
mistake, but thank you for the question.
Well, there we go.
That was the end of that then.
Andrew George, good to join us. Thank you so much for staying on to talk to us after a very long night. Thanks very much.
There is an interesting point, Hugh, which emerges from that interview. The debate that took place earlier in our Parliament about the alternative vote system. That would have allowed, if we'd had the alternative vote, the kind of discussion between parties before ballots were cast about transfers between parties where there were common values, if there were common values. And also in terms of the election night we've just had, instead of having the whole campaign taken up with what would happen after the general election took place and that dominant debate so long, if there could have been much more mature debate during the campaign about the relations between parties, I think we would have got to a much better position. Obviously, it's water under the bridge. The AV referendum was defeated. But I think this election has been a good example of the merits of AV.
Well, now that we have that result in from St Ives, we've spoken there to Andrew George, who lost his seat. Let's join Emily, who can tell us a little more about the region.
He was trying to make sense of that result, wasn't he, Hugh? And I don't know if he can take heart from the fact it clearly wasn't a personal thing. Look at this whole area of the southwest. It has turned entirely blue now. You can just see the red of Plymouth Moorview for Labour. But this was a very, very strong battleground between the Lib Dems and the Tories. We're used to seeing a lot of yellow and blue fighting together, and now they've all been wiped out. If you look at the scoreboard there, the Conservatives have gained 15 seats directly from the Lib Dems, so he's not alone. I'm going to show you what it looks like when you actually put them together as a list. And we've talked about St Ives, Andrew George's seat. What about Yeovil there? This is an astonishing result, really. David Laws, who was the schools minister, looked to be very, very safe, had a 50% share of the vote. That has been overturned by the Conservatives. You can just see what happens to the Lib Dem vote, down 23% against the Conservatives. Maybe Andrew George is right. Maybe this is about voters and coalition and that whole first election after seeing the Lib Dems in government. Devon North, the same sort of pattern here. You can see what's happened to the Lib Dem share again. Down 18. Down 18 or down 15 is starting to look like not as bad a result. I'll scoot through some more of them. You can see Bath here. Let's just see what's happened here. If I chop that board. Now we're talking about a really serious night for the Lib Dems. Their share of the vote down 27%, and you can see it goes on and on. One thing that's quite interesting to notice here is that UKIP once again is slipping into third place. It's an interesting question for us now, isn't it? Do we treat UKIP as the third party because they tend to come in here as the second party of opposition? The Lib Dems are often quite down in the eastern areas we've seen. Do we treat Labour as out now? Who is that party? Who is the next party of opposition when we're trying to get a balanced discussion around a table? It's something we're going to have to sort out. We just don't know.
This is not quite as big a story as Scotland, but it's a huge story as well. Just as we had a long, long Labour tradition in Scotland, which has been wiped out, so there's been a very, very long Liberal tradition in the West Country. They tended to be kind of thrawn, independent-minded, Eurosceptic, very special kind of breed of politicians, and they have all gone. An astonishing moment.
Yeah, I mean, possibly the sort of agricultural, the fishing industries, there's a lot of Euroscepticism there. Whether that has been a transfer, we don't know at this stage, the sense of churn, but whether the Lib Dem vote could have actually gone directly to UKIP. Yeah. That's something that we'll find out in the...
It also, of course, having looked at what's happened on Emily's map to that bit of the southwest, Charles Clarke, just makes your task even greater. If you think of the three things, there could be boundary changes. You've got Scotland, you've got Conservatives taking over in Lib Dem areas and you failing to take over in Conservative areas. That is a massive, massive battle to build.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sorry, just absolutely enormous. I couldn't agree more. And unfortunately, it's not only in the southwest, but in other parts of the country as well. And that's why I was saying earlier, we've really got to go back into it and think, well, what is our appeal? How do we identify with people living in the southwest of England? The traditions that Andrew describes are quite right. I do think there's one other thing, though, Hugh, when one's talking about UKIP and indeed the SNP. There's a big chunk of people in Britain who are so disaffected with politics completely. It's not just a British factor, also Marine Le Pen in France, also in many other countries. And what Nicola Sturgeon did brilliantly was to lead that. What UKIP have done brilliantly is to lead that. So you get the people coming in behind them, expressing their anger with the, quotes, Westminster political system as a whole. The way to solve that isn't to vilify the SNP or to vilify UKIP or whatever, in my opinion. It's for the main parties, including the opposition party, Labour in this case, to demonstrate how, working together with the government party, we can address those problems like immigration, welfare reform, the ageing society and so on, which are deep. People see immigration, they think, Christ, why can't they solve it? Welfare reform, why are those people getting those, and so on. And we're showing our impotence to solve those things. And that means that they get more disaffected and so are more likely to go with either, in the Scottish case, the SNP, who've become the leaders of that, or more generally the UKIP case. And I think the obligation is really on the main parties, including Labour, to work with the Conservatives to try and solve some of these problems.
Good to have you with us, Charles. Thank you very much. Charles Clarke there, the former Labour Home Secretary. Word coming in from Washington that President Obama has sent his congratulations to Prime Minister Cameron on the election victory, and says he looks forward to strengthening the bond between the two countries. That's just from Reuters just a couple of minutes ago. President Obama sending his congratulations. More from the BBC Election Centre in just a moment. First, we're going to get the latest news, and we're joining Louise again.
Good afternoon. David Cameron has pledged to build on the foundations laid by the last government after the Conservatives secured a Commons majority in the general election. With all the results now declared, the Tories have 331 MPs. Labour's Ed Miliband, the Liberal Democrats' Nick Clegg and Nigel Farage of UKIP have all resigned as their party's leader. Our political correspondent Ben Wright reports.
Confirmed as Prime Minister once more, David Cameron's victory was emphatic. No hung parliament, no haggle for power. Mr Cameron has bucked the pollsters and delighted his party.
This is a country with unrivalled skills and creativeness. A country with such good humour and such great compassion. And I'm convinced that if we draw on all of this, then we can take these islands with our proud history and build an even prouder future. Together, we can make Great Britain greater still.
Labour's Ed Miliband believed the keys to number 10 were within reach, but it was a devastating defeat. Resigning today as leader, Ed Miliband had this message for his party.
I am truly sorry I did not succeed. I've done my best for nearly 5 years. Now you need to show your responsibility. Your responsibility, not simply to mourn our defeat, but to pick yourself up and continue the fight. We've come back before, and this party will come back again.
And across Westminster, a second party leader resigned. But there were cheers of defiance and support for a shattered Nick Clegg.
Clearly, the results have been immeasurably more crushing and unkind than I could ever have feared. For that, of course, I must take responsibility, and therefore I announce that I will be resigning as leader of the Liberal Democrats. This is a very dark hour for our party, but we cannot and will not allow decent Liberal values to be extinguished overnight.
This is when the night's drama began, seconds after the polls closed.
We are saying the Conservatives are the largest party.
Hardly anyone predicted that. The Tories looked set to beat Labour into a distant second place, and the Liberal Democrats appeared doomed. Labour's troubles and the Conservatives' triumph soon began to unfold in counts across the country. Take Nuneaton, a top Labour target, just before 2 a.m, a sign of things to come. The Conservative Party held it comfortably, as it did dozens of seats Labour hoped to win in England. And then, long after dawn, the most jaw-dropping result of all.
18,776.
Ed Balls, the architect of an economic policy roundly rejected by voters, was himself thrown out. Labour losses in Scotland were expected, but it was a wipeout. The SNP took every Labour seat bar one. Douglas Alexander had hoped to be Labour's Foreign Secretary today. Instead, he was beaten by a 20-year-old SNP student. Nicola Sturgeon's party has destroyed Labour's Scottish heartland in a rout that saw the SNP take 56 of Scotland's 59 seats.
This was a vote to make Scotland's voice heard loudly at Westminster. Scotland voted for that yesterday, and it's now the job of the SNP to represent those who voted for us and to represent those who didn't, to make Scotland's voice heard.
Liberal Democrat MPs were also dispatched with brutal efficiency by the SNP. Danny Alexander gone. Charles Kennedy gone. It was the same in England and Wales. Nick Clegg clung on to his seat, but dozens of others did not. It's the SNP that now replaces the Liberal Democrats as the third largest party here at Westminster. And this election proves how wide the political chasm now is between Scotland and the rest of the Union, with potentially huge consequences for how Parliament and the United Kingdom are run. Across Britain, UKIP won many more votes than the SNP, but took just a single seat. The party's leader, Nigel Farage, failed to win in South Thanet and said the electoral system was broken. This morning he quit, but might come back.
There will be a leadership election for the next leader of UKIP in September, and I will consider, over the course of this summer, whether to put my name forward to do that job again.
Together for a final time at the Cenotaph this afternoon. David Cameron said he would lead as a one-nation Prime Minister, recognising there are big divisions to bridge. But from now, the Conservatives will govern alone. Ben Wright, BBC News, Westminster.
Plaid Cymru have held 3 seats in Wales but failed to win several of their target seats. The winners there were the Conservatives, who gained 3 MPs, taking their total to 11, while Labour remained the biggest party with 25 seats. One of the biggest shocks in Northern Ireland came in Fermanagh and South Tyrone, where Sinn Féin were unseated by the Ulster Unionist Party. The UUP, who had no MPs after the last election, also won in South Antrim. Peter Robinson's Democratic Unionist Party remain the largest party in Northern Ireland, holding 8 of 18 seats. So you are right up to date. Let's catch up with the weather. Alex has it. Good afternoon.
Afternoon, Louise. Things warming up for many of us over the next few days, but it's not necessarily going to be sunny. In fact, quite a wet Friday evening across northern England, North Wales, parts of southern Scotland. That rain fizzling out through the night. It's quite a blustery night along the south coast of England. A warmer night than recent nights, double figures across the south, but still pretty chilly across northern Scotland, close to freezing for some here. Dull, damp start then to Saturday. Outbreaks of rain and drizzle across southern eastern Scotland, northern England. Some heavy showers whizzing across southern areas, but the showers tend to fade through the day, and most of us end up with sunny spells come Saturday afternoon and evening. So brightening up for most places through the day. Temperatures around about average, maybe up to 18 or 19 across the southeast. Sunday sees some wet weather for western Scotland, rain arriving in Northern Ireland, damp and drizzly around western parts of England and Wales. For many central and eastern areas, though, Sunday a fine day and showing signs of warming up. 20 degrees is possible, Louise.
Well, that sounds nice, Alex. Thank you. That's it for now. We'll have another summary for you at 5 o'clock. Back to Hugh.
Welcome back once again to the BBC Election Centre. It is nearly 4:15. All the results are in this campaign, and we are now just concentrating on analysing what happened and thinking about what happens next, not least some of the big ministerial appointments that Mr Cameron is likely to make, we think, in the course of the next 90 minutes or so, but we'll have to see on that. The reshuffle, we're told, is meant to begin at around tea time, so let's take that to be 4:30 p.m, so we should get some names quite soon. While we wait for them, why don't we pay a visit to Westminster, and Andrew Neil, who has some more guests for us. Let's see if Andrew's there.
Do indeed, Hugh. Thank you for that. We're joined by Tristram Hunt, Shadow Education spokesman under Mr Miliband. I think we spoke about 15 hours ago.
We did, Andrew.
And we're still standing or sitting
exactly.
Anyway. Now, I was just looking at the figures. The Conservatives now have 100 seats more than Labour. I mean, I never saw that coming. I don't think you saw it coming. It's very early days, but have you come to any initial conclusions as to what happened and why?
Well, this is a really significant and damaging result for the Labour Party. Lots of communities up and down the country who rely on Labour councils and Labour governments will be feeling the effects of this. What happened was that we failed to offer a compelling vision of the future, which married a social democratic future to the personal aspirations of voters in Britain. And when we now begin to think about the future of the party, we have to think about the new landscape of Britain, the self-employed, the small business owner, the owner-occupier, and how our messages to them will think that their family's future, their material aspirations, their personal aspirations will find a home in the Labour Party. And I think with that, there's what you've been reflecting on all evening, this broader cultural conversation about nationalism. And the Labour Party needs to speak to a growing national identity in Scotland and also, crucially, a national identity in England. And the loss of Rowena Davies, for example, our candidate in Southampton, or Lucy Rigby in Lincoln, or our candidate Lee Sheriff in Carlisle, these are areas where a sense of Englishness and pride in English identity somehow didn't find an expression through the Labour Party, and it did find an expression, certainly in Stoke-on-Trent as elsewhere, in UKIP. And that's part of the framing we have to think about.
Now, you're into a leadership contest. We don't know exactly how quickly, but it'll probably be pretty quickly. Before you determine who your new leader should be, don't you need to decide what kind of centre-left party you want to be?
I think that's exactly right, and this is a challenge social democratic parties are wrestling with all over Europe, and we're seeing in many parts of Europe a hollowing out of social democratic parties. So we need to have a full, open, frank conversation, and today our calling on the NEC not to rush our leadership.
That's the Labour and the National Executive Committee.
The Labour National Executive Committee, not to rush our election of a leader and deputy leader. This needs to take time. We're going to face the full horrors of a 5-year fixed-term parliament, it seems, with this.
Because the Tories are probably in for 5 years now, aren't they?
So we have time to do this and think about ourselves and who should lead us properly and appropriately. We can't have any machine politics. We can't have any stitch and fix of this. This needs to take place with, I think, a really detailed and quite brutal post-mortem about what's happened and the underlying thinking and philosophy and organisation behind it.
Is there a danger, as always happens, particularly when Labour loses elections, that you get into a rather arid argument of we lost because we were too left-wing, no, we lost because we weren't left-wing enough?
Yes, and I think we do have to go beyond that. We do have to go beyond those old sort of Blair-Brown dichotomies. I think one of the regrets I had about the general election campaign, not the Labour Party campaign, but the whole conversation, was how we didn't really address the big issues about the impact of technology on Western labour markets, about the ageing society and our social welfare model, about European competitiveness. Let's have that then in the Labour leadership contest and bring in new voices. I think one of Ed Miliband's great legacies as leader of the party was the pluralism and diversity he brought to it, but also the reforms to party organisation, which meant that actually lots of people can be involved in picking the new leader and discussing what he or she thinks.
Is there an underlying tension within Labour, which isn't so much left-right, but it's about who is comfortable and has done well out of globalisation, the people in London and so on, and we had, I think it was John Mann on earlier, from a lot of traditional working-class voters, certainly coming from working-class families in the north, feel that it's kind of passed them by. They've not had the benefits, and they may just not vote, or they don't vote for Labour, or they may even toy with UKIP.
That's exactly right. I think what we found in many seats were the people who said they weren't voting actually were going to go and vote UKIP. And they did feel left behind by globalisation. And again, that's both economic in terms of migration and depression of wages, often in manual industries, but also culture, and a fear that they couldn't express their culture, that they weren't allowed to do that. And again, we in the Labour Party need to be very confident about supporting that space and encouraging that diversity and encouraging that celebration of Englishness and Scottishness, but within a party of the Union. And we are under pressure on that because there's pressure from UKIP in the south and there's pressure from the SNP in the north, but we still remain a party of the United Kingdom.
It seems to me it's going to be quite a long struggle back. I mean, Scotland is a huge mountain you now have to I mean, the SNP may be at their peak now, it won't get better for them, but there's a huge mountain for you to climb. As I said, you're 100 seats behind the Tories. And the Tories, I was speaking to Grant Shapps earlier, the chairman of the Tory party, they will now come in with the boundary changes now happen, and that's another 20, 25 seats to the Tories. So it's you've got to get the analysis right and then get your act together quite quickly, don't you?
Exactly, but I think we've got to get over thinking if only we won 10 seats here or 15 seats. This is a step change. This is a conceptual change in the Labour movement and the Labour Party and how we think about ourselves. And if we're worrying about losing 15 seats because of boundary changes, yes, that is problematic. But when you've got a convincing argument about the future, about a social democratic future which speaks to people's aspirations, then the mechanics will take care of themselves.
You're a historian. The situation Labour finds itself in now, can you see a previous point in history where it faced similar challenges and had to rise to that?
Yes, I mean, one can obviously point to 83 and what happened with the party there. One can go right back to 29 and some of the challenges which flowed from coalition politics right back then. But I think we should have faith in the Labour Party. I think we should have faith in Labour values. One of the hugely humbling experiences of being involved in a general election campaign is meeting just all the brilliant volunteers and activists and council candidates and parliamentary candidates. And there is a viable Labour movement out there. And one of our strengths in the campaign was just the sheer numbers of people we could put on the streets. But somehow the message that we were selling with and through those people was not connecting with the public.
Yes. Do you think that Ed Miliband has stood down? And Ed Balls has lost his seat, which is obviously a personal, real disappointment for him. And a lot of people in the Labour Party who admired him will be sad to see that happen too. If you want to look on the bright side, could you take the view, well, it draws a line under that. It draws a line over all these arguments about was the deficit too big in 2007? Did they spend too much? Let's get over that, and it gives you a fresh start.
I think that might be an argument for the future. I think today we pay tribute to the great leadership of Ed Miliband and the way he conducted himself as leader of the party, and similarly for Ed Balls and the way, that hammer blow to lose your seat as Shadow Chancellor. Yeah, didn't see it coming with great dignity and poise. And I think those of us still in the Parliamentary Labour Party pay tribute to both the great leadership of the Eds.
What about Tristram Hunt, leader of the Labour Party?
That, again, is for another day. It's about the lyrics as much as the lead singer, I think.
Very well. Thank you very much, Tristram Hunt. Let's go back to Hugh.
What a very neat, prepared answer that was by Tristram there. Rather classy answer, we thought, yes? Lots of nodding around the table here, Andrew. So, for those of you who weren't with us overnight, I think it's worth just recapping on a couple of the things to do with the Labour story. We mentioned Ed Balls there losing his seat and in Morley and Outwood, but there were other big casualties as well. So why don't we just join Emily for a second to just remind ourselves what went on?
That question we always used to ask after 1997, were you still up for Portillo, has been pushed back a few hours, but this is a very similar moment in terms of the jaw-dropping effect it had on television sets in the studio here and I'm sure at home. But if you weren't up, this is what happened. You'll see Ed Balls, Shadow Chancellor, who worked very closely with Ed Miliband on many of his economic policies, has been pushed out by Andrea Jenkyns for the Conservatives. And you can see here what a slight majority it is. She holds 422 more votes. That's why the count was delayed. That's why we understand there was a recount. Ed Balls asking for a recount because he realised things weren't going his way. UKIP in third place here, but it really is a story of a big beast who's left. Let me just show you what's happened overnight. And isn't it interesting to see that the Labour vote has hardly shifted here? It's not moved at all. But UKIP has taken gains, the Lib Dems have lost, and that was just enough, that push up for the Conservatives, just enough to take that on a swing of, let's see, 1.6. Interesting geographically, Ed Balls had this constituency very close to Yvette Cooper, his wife's in Normanton. There was a sort of marital geographical effect, which of course has now gone. She remains in the House of Commons. He is out. Let me take you to a couple of other ones. You won't be surprised to see these are in Scotland. Paisley and Renfrewshire South. Not only the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Douglas Alexander, but the architect of Labour's whole election campaign has been pushed out. And there must be a certain amount of humiliation being pushed out by a student of 20 years old who came to the count, thanked her mum and dad for all their help. And you can see Mhairi Black has taken this. It's an extraordinary success story for the SNP and a pretty miserable one for Labour. We never get tired of seeing these swings in the seats that the SNP have taken. 27% swing, unheard of, but not the greatest by any means in Scotland overnight. One more, Renfrewshire East, Jim Murphy being pushed into second place. He was the one that was the cheerleader for Labour, the Labour leader in Scotland, and he's been pushed out. A very direct message from the voters that they don't like what Labour is doing in Scotland. 40% to 34%, and you can see the kind of swing again. 24% swing. We have seen them up to 39. And I'm going to bring one more in. This isn't a big name, but it just gives you an indication of the sort of battles. This was the most vulnerable Conservative seat in the country. Labour only needed 54 to overturn a majority of 54. They had Mike O'Brien, the former immigration minister, standing against a nobody, if you'll forgive me saying that. He wasn't an incumbent for the Conservatives. But the Conservatives held on here. Craig Tracy has held on in Warwickshire North. That started to tell the story at the beginning of the night of the places that Labour wasn't picking up, but those big scalps like Ed Balls, I don't think anyone would ever have foreseen.
No.
Jo?
No, certainly wouldn't have foreseen that, I have to say. I mean, it's funny, isn't it, as we reflect back on an evening where the results were incredible in so many cases, and here we are on Friday afternoon, and we're expecting announcements on cabinet posts from David Cameron and Number 10. All happened so quickly, as so many people be licking their wounds. There is going to be great anticipation in the Tory backbenches, and obviously ministers wondering. There we are. I'll be announcing some cabinet posts over the next couple of hours. This from the office of David Cameron, the Prime Minister. In fact, we're expecting it in the next few minutes. I think we're expecting the four great offices of state to be announced. I don't think there'll be a surprise with Chancellor. I'd be very surprised if it changes from George Osborne, but we will be looking carefully at Foreign Secretary, at Home Secretary, obviously, because some of those who were suggested as being a threat to David Cameron, should he not win an outright majority, Theresa May, for example, we'll have to see what happens to her.
Absolutely. It's a very delicate balancing act always. You want to be refreshing your government, you want it to look new and interesting and exciting, but you can't hack off, I say very carefully, too many of your big beasts. There's one of them going into this.
George Osborne knocking at the door at Number 10, and just before 4:30 on this Friday. So will he be in the same job as Chancellor? We kind of assume he will, Andrew.
Well, we know he will, because he's now tweeting that his first priority as Chancellor would be to build that northern powerhouse he's been going on about so many times. So he'll be back into the high-vis vest before you can say...
He loves those high-vis vests, doesn't he?
He loves those high-vis vests.
So many photo opportunities of the Chancellor and possibly continuing to be the Chancellor. And the Northern Powerhouse was very much his project, as you say, and David Cameron mentioned it in his speech outside Downing Street.
And Osborne picked up Cameron's One Nation rhetoric. So to build One Nation, we have to build the Northern Powerhouse. That's my priority. So we know what he's up to. OK, well, we'll keep an eye on Downing Street, because clearly the reshuffle is underway. And let's join someone who knows Downing Street rather well from a different age. That is Lord Tebbit, who, as Norma Tebbit was the Conservative Party chairman in Mrs Thatcher's day. Lord Tebbit, thank you so much for joining us. What are your thoughts on the results overnight?
Well, I think it was quite extraordinary. I'm quite sure that the opinion polls were not that inaccurate, but at the final stages, the last hours, really, of the campaign, an enormous number of people who'd been tempted to abstain or to go to UKIP decided that the risk of getting a Miliband-Balls coalition with the SNP or something of that kind was just too much to take, and they came back to the Conservative Party with the result that we've seen, a quite extraordinary result.
When you mentioned the SNP there, Lord Tebbit, what are your thoughts on the fact that we seem now to live in at least in two nations, because the Scots clearly have gone in one direction and the English in another?
Well, yes, but of course the Scots haven't yet tumbled to the fact that the SNP is not proposing independence for Scotland. they're proposing that Scotland should be like Latvia and Estonia and countries like that in the Little Boys League, whom nobody takes any notice at all, still in the European Union, still being told what to do by Brussels, without any influence there whatsoever.
Andrew Marr is with me, Lord Tebbit. Andy, what would you say?
I was just wondering what your advice, as it were, would be to the Prime Minister about how to deal with the SNP surge now. How would you respond to them? Ignore them, lock them out? What would you do?
Well, I've been an advocate for a long time now of establishing a proper Scottish Unionist party, not a Westminster party, not associated with the Westminster establishment, which is even more unpopular in Scotland than it has been in England, but a grassroots organisation that would fight for the Union. And I think that's what we need, and sooner or later that's what we'll have to have.
Jo Coburn is with us as well, Lord Tebbit. She'd like to ask something.
Yes, I mean, Norman Tebbit, looking ahead to the referendum as proposed by David Cameron, the in-out referendum, does that risk the party again fighting in itself, the Tory party, over the prospect of an in-out referendum?
Well, I think there is a risk. You see, up to now, Mr Cameron has had the luxury of being able to agree a policy in the Quad. Danny Alexander, Mr Osborne and Mr Clegg and the Prime Minister could agree a policy, impose it on the Cabinet and impose it on the Commons without much fear of problems. That's over now. He's going to have to persuade his own party to accept things. And that's going to be a lot more difficult for him. Whichever way he points on the referendum will have problems. I think almost everybody on the Tory benches now will agree that they are committed to a referendum in 2017. Of course, that will then depend on the renegotiation, which, as we know, is going to be extremely difficult for Mr Cameron to bring anything useful back from Brussels.
So you don't have any faith in that renegotiation?
Pardon?
You don't have any faith in that renegotiation?
I'm sure that Mr Cameron will try very hard, and I'm equally sure that nothing significant can be agreed because we are still on the way to the Europe which Mr Delors set out in Mrs Thatcher's time, that the Commission should be the government, that the European Parliament should be the democratic organ, and the Council of Ministers should be the Senate. And you'll remember that to that proposition she said no, no and no. And I think that's what we should say now.
A final point, Lord Tebbit, if I may, because this reshuffle is obviously getting underway. Would you agree that George Osborne should stay on as Chancellor? And who do you think should be Foreign Secretary?
Oh, I hadn't thought very much about that. I think that George Osborne should stay on as Chancellor. I think he will miss Danny Alexander in many ways, who was quite outstanding amongst the Lib Dems, in my view. And he is a terrible loss. To lose him and gain a 20-year-old youngster is a bit sad for Parliament, I think.
Thanks very much, Lord Tebbit, for joining us. It's good of you to talk to us.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Lord Tebbit there, yeah?
He got his Alexanders slightly.
Yes.
It's Douglas Alexander who lost to the 20-year-old.
Mary Black is the 20-year-old.
That's right, she's the 20-year-old.
Danny
What's
Alexander
interesting, though...
lost to the SNP leader of Highland Council,
That's right,
if I remember.
That's right.
Well remembered after so many hours.
But I mean, completely wrong.
Well, no, I think you are right, actually. Interesting, though, the talk about the EU referendum by Norman Tebbit and what might happen within the party. The choice of Foreign Secretary, of course, and a Europe Minister will be absolutely critical, especially if David Cameron decides it needs a Eurosceptic.
Now, you raised, I don't know if I can say this, but you raised a very intriguing possibility when you pointed out that Graham Brady from the 1922 committee had been going into number 10. I just wondered whether he might be part of Cameron's new European team. Be very clever.
Well, that would certainly go down very well with a certain section of the party. There's no doubt about it. Or at least he might have been discussing his plans with Graham Brady as the mouthpiece of the backbench Tories.
Yeah.
It's just coming up to 25 to 5, and we are expecting news of that reshuffle quite soon. Before that, why don't we just reflect on how the Greens did overnight, because they did have hopes in quite a few seats, including Bristol West and elsewhere, and Holborn and St Pancras, but they held on to Brighton Pavilion. Emily, tell us a little more.
Yes, I know you're going to be speaking to Natalie Bennett soon, and she's had a very visible campaign. We were all interested to see whether all the television appearances and all the media interviews would actually translate into a better share of the vote. This is how it pans out for all the parties, and you can see the Greens are down here on 4%. They may look at it and say, well, they've made gains of 3%. But you have to remember that they stood this time in 570 seats or so. That's a massive, massive increase on last time. So I wonder whether they'll genuinely feel that that has been properly represented, if you like, if they have seen enough translation of the places they stood into share of the vote. We know they've only got one seat. So the good story of the night was in Brighton Pavilion for Caroline Lucas, who's proved a very popular local MP here. She's taken 42% share of the vote. And if we just have a look and see what actually that meant, she's made gains of 11%. It looks as if they've come from the Lib Dem vote there. That has tanked the same number, but obviously there could be some churn in between. So a good night for Caroline Lucas. The one Green MP has held her seat, and you can see it's a swing away from Labour to the Greens of 6.1%. But if we scroll through, and I can tell you at the beginning of the night, we were keeping a key eye on places like Bristol West. This was the Greens' best chance of gaining a seat in the South West. They've pulled up to second place. They'll be very pleased with that percentage share, 27%. But when you think that this is the one that they really wanted to be able to hold up and claim as a new gain, I think they'll be disappointed not to have actually taken it. And there's another seat like that in Norwich South. That was the other one. You might remember at the beginning of the night, our forecast was suggesting they could get one, they might get two. So we started looking with particular interest at Bristol West and Norwich South. Here, the Greens didn't fare quite so well. You can see the Conservatives are still in second place, the Greens in third place. 14% share of the vote, much higher than in other places, but it's still not enough to get them anywhere near the likes of another seat. And I'll show you Holborn and St Pancras. This is where Natalie Bennett herself was standing. She was up against the former DPP, Director of Public Prosecutions, Keir Starmer, who's taken it easily for Labour on 53% share of the vote. The Conservatives in there on 22%. This is Frank Dobson's old seat in London. And the Greens on 13%. I wonder if she'll feel, after weeks of campaign and interviews and the panels and the debates, whether it was all worth it.
What do we think? Thanks, Emily. What do we think, Joe?
Well, I mean, if you look at some of this, very disappointing, I think, for, as you say, after such a high-profile campaign. If you think of the debates, you've never seen so much of, in some ways, I know the Green supporters will disagree, but you haven't seen so much of people like Natalie Bennett. On our debates, on the programmes we ran through the afternoon on the BBC, we had a whole range of Green spokespeople who were, you know, very, very good. But they will feel that apart from Caroline Lucas, they haven't got much further. Let's go straight to Andrew at Westminster to talk to the Green Party leader.
Thank you, Hugh. We have indeed got Natalie Bennett here. So the Green surge turned out to be a ripple.
Absolutely not. I mean, we've seen a vote of 1.1 million people have voted Green in a general election, 4 times more than ever before. Of course, as the report highlighted, really critically, we've seen Caroline Lucas, the brilliant Green MP for Brighton, brilliant re-elected.
But you had that already. You started the election campaign with 1 MP. You never had more publicity for the Green Party in modern British, ever in the history of this country, and you ended up with 1 MP.
Well, of course, we have a first-past-the-post electoral system, and I've been saying for some time that the clear loser from this election was going to be the first-past-the-post electoral system. If we had a fair proportional system, we'd have 25 seats. But what we have is a huge foundation.
As you know, UKIP would have a lot more.
Well, no, they would, and that would be a fair proportional system. But, you know, we've finished fourth. We've finished second in 4 seats, which is something the Green Party has never, ever finished second in a general election seat ever before. As you highlighted, Bristol West, we did tremendously well. And if you just look at one other comparison that shows the growth around the country, in 2010, we saved 6 deposits, got more than 5% in 6 seats. This time we have more than 100 seats where we've got more than that 5%. And if you look at places like Sheffield Central, Liverpool Riverside, Manchester Gorton, and of course Bristol, you look at the spread of that, and we've really now become a truly national party, as well as having more than 4 times the membership that we had at the start of the campaign.
Your membership's gone up, and the share of the vote's gone up too, from a very low base, from 1% to 3.8%. But that's because you fought more seats. So, but it follows that if you fight more seats, you get a little bit bigger share of the vote.
Well, I think we fought, almost not quite double the number of seats. We stood in a little bit more than 50% last time.
It was double this time.
So it was double this time.
You must be a bit disappointed.
And of course, also, of course, we were tending to stand in the seats where we would have expected to get the higher results anyway. So obviously, we've got some excellent results in places like Newcastle, standing for the first time. So what we've really done is we've got the Green Party now here as a place on the political landscape. And of course, this is in the first past the post election, which is very much not friendly to us.
But other parties have broken through with first past the post. The Liberals have done it, Liberal Democrats have done it, though of course they've now gone in the other direction. And the Scottish Nationalists have done it with first past the post as well. So it can be done. Isn't there a fear in your mind that this may be as good as it gets? I mean, everything was going your way. This time you got into the debates. There was the sight of you and Nicola Sturgeon and Leanne Wood. It may be much tougher next time.
Well, no, I think what we're seeing is, this is the start of the Green surge, and the SNP is a very good parallel for this. Because
just to interrupt for a second, I do apologise. We've just seen pictures of Theresa May going into Downing Street. We know the Prime Minister is going to appoint, I think it's the 4 great offices of state, one of which includes the Home Secretary. We don't know if she's going to be renewed as Home Secretary. He was there for the whole of the last government, or whether she's going to get another great office of state. I do apologise. Carry on.
So, I mean, for the Green Party, in fact, in the last 24 hours or so, we've added another 1,000 new members. The Green surge for us is very much just starting. We've got strong growth around the country. We're looking to proportional representation elections next year in London, in Wales, and of course in Holyrood for the Scottish Greens. So, we're really in an excellent political place to really grow.
I tell you, speaking to some German Greens, they were quite critical of the British Greens. They said, you need to grow up. They said, and they looked at their own history. They said they remembered when they were a kind of green Trotsky party with all sorts of far left ideas, and bit by bit they kept their left of centre ideology, but they moved more into the mainstream. Isn't that what you have to do now?
Well, I would say that the German Greens and us, we're all part of a political family. Families can have quite a broad spectrum of views. And if you look at Australian Greens, New Zealand Greens, etc.
I'm really sorry to do this again, but I've just heard that George Osborne has been reappointed as Chancellor. So
I'm not sure that's actually news, really, but I take your point.
I'm sure you're very excited by that. But the German Greens are now more mainstream than you are. And you've got not just you, but your party. You did get into some trouble over the election campaign by rather vague and expensive ideas in your party policy remit.
Well, I wouldn't accept that. I think what we were presenting was a real message of hope, of a different model of a different kind of society, which even despite the first past the post electoral system has won significant support. And I think what we're going to see, particularly in the coming period, as the Labor Party, debates its future, there's a real space for us. Caroline Lucas was in many ways the real opposition in the last Parliament, whether it was on defending the rights of disabled people, whether it was on fracking, whether it was on a whole range of issues like bringing the railways back into public hands. We're going to be there as a real force, defending the idea of a different kind of society that works for the common good, not just for the few.
We've had 3 leader resignations today. You're not going to make it a 4th?
Absolutely not. I was re-elected unopposed by the Green Party members last September for a 2-year term. I'll be serving that 2-year term, at least.
All right. Natalie Bennett, thank you very much. Let's go back to Hugh.
Andrew, thanks very much. Yes, indeed, we have our first appointment in this reshuffle, and it does confirm that George Osborne stays in post as Chancellor. But as Joe is about to tell us, there's more than that.
Yes, I mean, I think we can show here up on the screen this tweet from David Cameron. I've reappointed George Osborne. That doesn't come as a surprise as Chancellor of the Exchequer, but he will also be First Secretary of State, the ranking Cabinet Minister. He wanted to give him something else, something extra. He wanted to say, I owe it to you in terms of the good economic headlines and so on and so forth. And so he's given a little, exactly. make him feel a little bit more important. And, of course, that role was occupied by Michael Heseltine, by John Prescott. I mean, in effect, it's the Deputy Prime Minister role, I suppose, that was occupied by Nick Clegg.
Well, I wonder also whether this is an indication that he wants George Osborne to lead those negotiations in Europe. That's a little bit of extra seniority. He's my man, not only in the in the Treasury, but also in the European.
And it's a key date in the diary, isn't it, for 2 years' time? That would certainly make sense. Although
that might be what it might be what it means, yeah.
Let's go straight to Downing Street. Norman Smith is there for us, our assistant political editor. Norman, we've just announced the news in that sense, but what do you make of it?
Well, I think it's entirely understandable that the Prime Minister would be reluctant to move the Chancellor, given we know the economy is such a central issue. Just to say, we saw Theresa May going in. I thought, and it's only impression, I thought she looked rather grim-faced, and I just wonder whether maybe there's a little bit of nervousness that maybe she's going to be moved to the Foreign Office, which can be a very arduous and demanding post in terms of the travel and the commitments and the energy and the effort. It also takes you out, to some extent, of the front line of British politics. You can just be moved to one side. May just be the weather. She wasn't feeling too chirpy, but I just thought she looked... She was a little bit sombre when she went in. We'll find out shortly, I imagine, what she's going to get. If George Osborne is being kept in his post, that obviously limits the room for manoeuvre, but I wonder if she may indeed be moved to one side. In terms of Mr Osborne, I think that's absolutely right in terms of making him First Secretary. There will be a desire to have him involved in one way or another with the renegotiations with our EU partners, because that is absolutely central to the next 2 years, to Mr Cameron's political future and his political prospects. He has to cut a deal which can satisfy his party. The real danger if he doesn't, because he has such a slim majority, he is acutely vulnerable to rebellions, revolts, to unhappiness on his own backbenchers. So he has to strike a good deal, and I'm sure he would want his right-hand man, someone he trusts implicitly, to be carving out that deal in George Osborne.
Who do you expect to see in the street as well, Norman, in the next half hour or so? Do you have a sense of who else might turn up?
Well, we're told they will be the four main jobs. Philip Hammond, another interesting one in that you could argue keep him as Foreign Secretary, because then you reassure your party that you have a committed Eurosceptic fronting up to our European partners, but then you're kind of locked in. You seem to be limiting your room for manoeuvre. So it's possible there could just be a straight swap between Theresa May and Philip Hammond. Philip Hammond is a hardliner on a number of issues, particularly in dealing with terrorism and immigration. Therefore, he might be a comfortable fit for his party to have him as Home Secretary, and then simply to move Theresa May, as I say, into the Foreign Office berth.
Andy?
Another big question, it might be for tomorrow morning, not this evening, but a lot of Conservatives were very, very upset when Michael Gove was moved away from education. They thought it was a sop to the Liberal Democrats. Now this is a Tory-only administration. Would David Cameron bring him back and say, listen, I'm terribly sorry, would you mind finishing the job?
And he's also a very trusted part of the Cameron clique, certainly up until the point when he was deemed to be perhaps something that they needed to deal with because of the education establishment. But yes, I think you're right. That could be a possibility.
We'll be back with Norman in a second. Let's go to Daniel Sanford, our Home Affairs correspondent, who's at the Home Office. And Daniel, your thoughts there on Theresa May as Home Secretary, and maybe any whispers you're picking up as to what might be about to happen?
Well, staff here at the Home Office are certainly expecting a Home Secretary to walk through this door within the next hour or so. They're all geared up and ready to welcome the Home Secretary, but they don't yet know whether it'll be the same Home Secretary that they've had for the last 5 years, or whether it's going to be a new face. I think the strongest argument for Theresa May moving office is that she's been the longest-serving Home Secretary since Rab Butler, going right back to the beginning of the 1960s, when he finished his time as Home Secretary. And she's managed to survive a full 5-year term as Home Secretary without any of the traditional disasters undermining her and ending her career, as has happened to so many other people in the Home Office before. So it may be that although she feels that this is a job half done here, that she would welcome going somewhere else. I should say that this morning, when she was being interviewed on the election programme just after her count, she was making clear that she felt there was some unfinished business in the Home Office, in particular the issue of data communications data, I should say, because, of course, they felt they were held back by the Liberal Democrats in government and weren't able to push through these new changes, effectively upgrading the laws on telephone intercepts so that they could be applied to all sorts of new kinds of internet communications. So I think if she gets moved on, it'll be a sense of relief that she never got hit by a disaster. But if she stays, I think she'll roll up her sleeves and get on with it.
Of course, it's worth remembering at this point that there are so many more posts available now, aren't there? You know, David Cameron will be able to hand out quite a lot of the goodies. Absolutely. 25 posts, I'm told now, freed up, no Liberal Democrats, all those Tories who were very upset that they didn't get promotion, that they didn't reach the higher levels of state that they would like to. Well, this is David Cameron's opportunity.
But no Deputy Prime Minister. Now Nick Clegg has gone. That job has gone as well.
Daniel, just a thought before we leave you at the Home Office then, where we'll come back, obviously, if we know who the new Home Secretary is, if indeed it is a new Home Secretary. Just in terms of the manifesto pledges on the Conservative side, how heavy the workload at the Home Office could be over the next 3 or 4 years?
Well, I think it will be heavy, but it's not so much just the manifesto pledges. It is this relationship with the police. It's the sort of unspoken thing during the election campaign, is the deteriorating relationship between the government and the police. And certainly, I think if Theresa May stayed on, she would find she was walking into very, very difficult waters with the police over the next few years. And that may again be an argument for a change of Home Secretary, for a rebuilding of a relationship between the police and the Home Secretary, because she's carried out a lot of reform. There's a lot more reform to be done on the police, and it's got to the stage where certainly the rank-and-file police officers are starting to wish that they had somebody else in charge.
Thanks, Daniel, very much. We're still in Downing Street, and Philip Hammond, who's been Foreign Secretary for the past year or so, he's now arriving at number 10. So we've had George Osborne and Theresa May, and now Philip Hammond arriving to see the Prime Minister. And this is kind of following a pattern now, Andy, isn't it?
Yes, these must be good news appointments for the people concerned, because I think Tony Blair started the habit, if it was bad news, you could go in round the back, away from the press photographers and the hubbub. So the fact they have all gone in the front door, one after another, at exactly the time we know what the Prime Minister is up to, suggests that one way or another it's good news for these guys.
Right, well, while we're keeping an eye on the door there at number 10, let's just show you this picture. It's come from the number 10 press office. We already know, because he's become First Secretary of State and continues Chancellor. There it is. Looks like his very own press card. George Osborne becomes First Secretary of State and continues as Chancellor of the Exchequer. But as Andy said, I think it's good news for the moment for whoever goes in through the black door at number 10.
We will be keeping an eye, clearly, on what's going on in Downing Street. So we've seen 3 ministers go in so far, but we only know about George Osborne's appointment as First Secretary of State and Chancellor. To wait to see what's happening to Theresa May and to Philip Hammond. If there's any more, we'll be back immediately. But let's join Jeremy now for another aspect of what's been going on.
Thank you, Hugh. We had a big think before this election about whether the swingometer could still be used. And it can. It's served us very well over the last 24 hours. We've had to split it into 4 different swingometers. So we took you inside the Elizabeth Tower at Westminster and the 4 faces here of Big Ben. Now, this has actually proved very, very useful in analysing the different terrains, the different faces of this election, and let me show you why. Still the main swingometer, Conservative Labour, showing you the difference in swing between this election in 2015 and the last in 2010. So here we go. This is England and Wales only, and I'm going to ask it to show us the swing against the Conservatives to Labour. And you can see it really is quite feeble there. It's just about 1% into Conservative territory. Now, if the swing was applied evenly across England and Wales, these seats would go from blue to red, as they have on our machine, and you see that number there, 12. 12 seats would be gained by Labour. Of course, swing isn't applied evenly. It's not uniform. This is an average here, and it tends to have a patchwork effect. So let's see what actually happened here. And it's very interesting. You can see that Labour gained slightly fewer seats than you might anticipate. They also lost 8 as well in England and Wales to the Conservatives, so the net gain was only 2, a very poor result. but also some seats just way out of line with the swingometer. And these are always interesting in an election. You remember Montgomery's shirt, the last election when Lembit Opik lost his seat, was way off to the side. Here, these two, Vale of Clwyd and Gower in Wales, gained by the Conservatives against the run of play. Really interesting. And one that was good news for Labour, a highlight on a very dark night for them. Ilford North, there we are, nearly a 6% swing, gained them that. So the Conservative Labour swingometer in England and Wales really helped us to understand the result, as did the next one. Let me show you. So now we bring on, and we've never had this before, the SNP Labour swingometer, and we packed it with figures because we were aware of the polls and the potential of the SNP to do very, very well. We've never had it go up to 30 before. It's like the amplifier in Spinal Tap. But we nearly needed it to go even further. Have a look at what's happened here. So this is the Scottish result in swing. It's a swing against Labour to the SNP. It's up above 24%. If it was applied uniformly, it would colour all of those red seats yellow, which is what the swingometer's done. I'll show you what actually happened, and it's actually pretty much the same. So the swingometer then working really, really well, that this average swing is quite a good way of showing what the SNP did. Yes, there was a seat that was 39%, which went right off the scale. And yes, we should mention Edinburgh South, which resolutely stayed with Labour despite everything else that happened. But certainly you can see from that the SNP's night, and if we ever have a night like this again, we're going to go up to 40, I think, just to make sure we can cover all eventualities. 2 more to go. I hope you're enjoying this. It's fascinating for us to see the election through the eyes of the swingometer, 60 years old this year. OK, Conservative Lib Dem. Now, here we see how brutal and ruthless British politics is. These are coalition partners, and you watch the way the Conservatives just slashed through these Liberal Democrat seats. There we go, up to nearly 9%. So there's no messing about by the Conservatives here. This was the swing, and on an average swing, were it to be applied evenly, those yellow seats, those orange seats would go blue, and you would see 33 Conservative gains. What actually happened was this. Let's just have a look. Slightly more patchwork effect. 24 Conservative gains, but still absolutely devastating for the Liberal Democrats. And just one more for you. And again, we'll look rare points of light for Labour here, but this was one with some an unfortunate side story. Lib Dem Labour, actually Labour did very well against the Liberal Democrats, who were just folding in all parts of the country, north, south, east and west. So have a look at this, a monumental swing. We actually almost ran out of numbers on this one as well, because Labour had a greater swing against the Lib Dems than the Conservatives did, and under uniform swing they would have picked up quite a few seats. The problem is that actually there aren't that many Liberal Democrat seats that were vulnerable to that swing, because Labour Lib Dems did not go into a position where that kind of swing would transfer many seats, but it's because of the terrain in the election. So you've ended up here with one bit of good news for Labour. They had a good swing against the Liberal Democrats, but it didn't really help them very much. So the swingometer really, I hope, Hugh, helped us clarify some of the forces at work here.
Yes, and I thought that for next term, as you say, you may want to recalibrate in some areas. But it was dramatic, wasn't it? And,
really so, and I think maybe splitting off terrains helps clarity as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeremy, very much.
Thank you.
While Jeremy was taking us through some of the swings there, some of those record movements in the swingometer, we're told that Theresa May is to stay at the Home Office. So this is what happened just a few minutes ago. And Theresa May, who'd gone in, what was it, 10, 15 minutes ago? Can't be that long, not long. And has now left. So just a couple of minutes ago, so she's on her way back to the Home Office. So Daniel Sanford, when we talk to him later, will be able to tell us that she's gone back into the building, into the Home Office, after a long stewardship, avoiding some of the pitfalls that have been there to trip up other Home Secretaries. After 5 years, she's going back there now. Did she want to go back to the Home Office? We don't know. Maybe we'll get a hint of whether that's good news or disappointing news for Theresa May. But your thoughts on that, Jo?
Yes, I mean, I think it's interesting to speculate that maybe she would have liked to have done something else. She might have wanted to move from that department that is known, if you speak to any former Home Secretary. We had one here on the programme a little earlier, Charles Clarke, that somewhere he once said to me, there is always someone plotting your downfall. You just never know who it might be. But she has managed to survive that, you know, for years, in fact, in that position. We can... Now she's left, we can show, here she is, they seem to be putting out press cards, if you like, almost, for their reappointed members of the Cabinet. Theresa May continues as Home Secretary. As you say, very briefly inside. Also wanted to keep a woman, I should think, at the top table, and there she stays.
Baroness Shirley Williams has joined us. Shirley, thank you very much for coming in. And can I just ask you to hang on a second? Because we had a good chat. Yes, we'll talk to you about it, no question, but nice to see you. I want to say one thing about polls and exit polls at this point at 5 p.m. on Friday, because they are fraught with risk, and conducting an exit poll on this massive sample takes a lot of skill and a lot of expertise and a lot of hard work. And John Curtis is our resident expert, and I'm going to talk to John in a second, because John achieved a notable success with his team last night, and we'll talk to John in a moment, but Emily's going to underline for us what was achieved.
Hugh, if you were going to commission an 8-foot-high stone monument, I think at this point, as a pollster, that's what you'd want to have engraved on it. It's an absolutely extraordinary image. This is the exit poll, and you can see how closely that is mirrored in the actual results. If I tell you that at 5 to 10 last night, we were in a state of profound shock. We were deeply scared with the results from this exit poll that we had to take forward and try and apply to the story of the night. We did it. We had complete trust in that god of polling, John Curtis, and this is what happened. An exact replica of the exit poll shown up in the results of the night.
Well, with that in mind, can I say, John, from all of us, many congratulations. I know you've been up since early yesterday, so you're going to be very tired now, so maybe we'll make this your last contribution. But your reflections on what's happened, and what happened with the exit poll, first of all.
Well, I'm reminded of what happened 5 years ago. I'm afraid this is not the first time that I've walked into a studio at about 10:30 in the evening to be greeted with a deathly silence. I remind you that 5 years ago, indeed, the noble Lord Ashdown said that our exit poll was wrong because we forecast that the number of Liberal Democrat seats was going to be less than it had been in 2005. And I think it's fair to say that there was a fair degree of scepticism in the studio. Well, I have since apologised to the Liberal Democrats for having overestimated the number of seats that they were going to win in 2010. So having been through that fire once and having learnt to trust the data, the truth is you just trust the data, you analyse it professionally, and all we can honestly do is to say, well, this is what the data told us, and therefore report it. If we'd sat there trying to fiddle the figures and saying, oh, we don't believe it, etc., and then we'd got it wrong, I think we would quite rightly be criticised. If indeed the exit poll had been wrong, but we had faithfully told you what we had discovered, well, you can argue about whether it was a sensible idea to do in the first place, but at least we were being honest with you about what it actually said.
And some reflections on the campaign and the way polling's been conducted in the campaign, John, because we discussed this earlier. But I suppose, do you have some kind of tentative conclusions about the way this campaign has thrown up some issues around polling?
Well, I mean, certainly one of the characteristics of this campaign is that this is the first campaign at which polling being done over the internet has been the dominant mode as opposed to the subsidiary mode. Most of the opinion polls that were done over the internet. Now, that said, I'm not, by the way, saying that the internet polls are the reason why we got it wrong, because the truth is, at least in the final polls, there wasn't much discernible difference between the estimates of those polls that were conducted over the telephone and those that were done by internet. I think certainly what is true, I mean, the truth is that even since 1992, there's been a bit of a tendency in the opinion polls for them to underestimate Conservative, overestimate Labour, and we just saw that again, perhaps in a rather more uncomfortable size once again. And that's the reason why, as President of the British Polling Council, I recommended straight away that we should have an inquiry as to what's happened, not, as it were, to try and point the finger of blame, but the truth is the point about the Polling Council is that, indeed, pollsters do what they do in public. We all know how they do it. We can evaluate whether we think it's good or bad. Well, equally, given what's happened, they should indeed be investigated, and we will all find out, in order, with a view, basically, to try and see if we can do better in future.
John, you deserve a rest.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much for all your expertise and help overnight. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And today, of course, John Curtis there of Strathclyde University with a well-earned break. We'll be back in a second, be talking to Shirley Williams and Andy Marr and Joe Coburn. In the meantime, we're going to have a little break. We're going to join Louise for the latest news and weather update.
Thank you, Hugh. Good afternoon. David Cameron has pledged to build on the foundations laid by the last government after the Conservatives secured a Commons majority in the general election. With all the results now declared, the Tories have 331 MPs. Labour's Ed Miliband, the Liberal Democrats' Nick Clegg and Nigel Farage of UKIP have all resigned as their party's leader. Our political correspondent Ben Wright reports.
Confirmed as Prime Minister once more, David Cameron's victory was emphatic. No hung parliament, no haggle for power. Mr Cameron has bucked the pollsters and delighted his party.
This is a country with unrivalled skills and creativeness, a country with such good humour and such great compassion. And I'm convinced that if we draw on all of this, then we can take these islands with our proud history and build an even prouder future. Together, we can make Great Britain greater still.
Labour's Ed Miliband believed the keys to number 10 were within reach, but it was a devastating defeat. Resigning today as leader, Ed Miliband had this message for his party.
I am truly sorry I did not succeed. I've done my best for nearly 5 years. Now you need to show your responsibility. Your responsibility, not simply to mourn our defeat, but to pick yourself up and continue the fight. We've come back before, and this party will come back again.
And across Westminster, a second party leader resigned. But there were cheers of defiance and support for a shattered Nick Clegg.
Clearly, the results have been immeasurably more crushing and unkind than I could ever have feared. For that, of course, I must take responsibility, and therefore I announce that I will be resigning as leader of the Liberal Democrats. This is a very dark hour for our party, but we cannot and will not allow decent liberal values to be extinguished overnight.
This is when the night's drama began, seconds after the polls closed.
We are saying the Conservatives are the largest party.
Hardly anyone predicted that. The Tories looked set to beat Labour into a distant second place, and the Liberal Democrats appeared doomed. Labour's troubles and the Conservatives' triumph soon began to unfold in counts across the country. Take Nuneaton, a top Labour target, just before 2 a.m, a sign of things to come. The Conservative Party held it comfortably, as it did dozens of seats Labour hoped to win in England. And then, long after dawn, the most jaw-dropping result of all.
18,776.
Ed Balls, the architect of an economic policy roundly rejected by voters, was himself thrown out. Labour losses in Scotland were expected, but it was a wipeout. The SNP took every Labour seat bar one. Douglas Alexander had hoped to be Labour's Foreign Secretary today. Instead, he was beaten by a 20-year-old SNP student. Nicola Sturgeon's party has destroyed Labour's Scottish heartland in a rout that saw the SNP take 56 of Scotland's 59 seats.
This was a vote to make Scotland's voice heard loudly at Westminster. Scotland voted for that yesterday, and it's now the job of the SNP to represent those who voted for us and to represent those who didn't, to make Scotland's voice heard.
Liberal Democrat MPs were also dispatched with brutal efficiency by the SNP. Danny Alexander, gone. Charles Kennedy, gone. It was the same in England and Wales. Nick Clegg clung on to his seat, but dozens of others did not. It's the SNP that now replaces the Liberal Democrats as the third largest party here at Westminster. And this election proves how wide the political chasm now is between Scotland and the rest of the Union, with potentially huge consequences for how Parliament and the United Kingdom are run. Across Britain, UKIP won many more votes than the SNP, but took just a single seat. The party's leader, Nigel Farage, failed to win in South Thanet and said the electoral system was broken. This morning he quit, but might come back.
There will be a leadership election for the next leader of UKIP in September, and I will consider, over the course of this summer, whether to put my name forward to do that job again.
Together for a final time at the Cenotaph this afternoon. David Cameron said he would lead as a one-nation Prime Minister, recognising there are big divisions to bridge. But from now, the Conservatives will govern alone. Ben Wright, BBC News, Westminster.
In the last few minutes, David Cameron has begun the reshuffle of his cabinet. He's announced George Osborne will remain as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Philip Hammond will stay as Foreign Secretary. Theresa May has also been reappointed as Home Secretary. Further announcements are expected within the hour. Plaid Cymru have held 3 seats in Wales but failed to win several of their targets. Plaid, led by Leanne Wood, are now the 4th party in Wales. The winners there were the Conservatives, who gained 3 MPs, taking their total to 11, and UKIP, who are now the 3rd biggest party. Welsh Labour has most MPs, winning 25 seats on 37% of the vote. One of the biggest shocks in Northern Ireland came in Fermanagh and South Tyrone, where Sinn Féin were unseated by the Ulster Unionist Party. The UUP, who had no MPs after the last election, also won in South Antrim. Peter Robinson's Democratic Unionist Party remain the largest party in Northern Ireland, holding 8 of 18 seats. So you are right up to date with the very latest. Let's find out about the weather this afternoon. Alex has it. Hello.
Thanks very much, Louise. Things warming up a little bit over the next few days through the weekend and to the early part of next week. It's not necessarily going to be gloriously sunny everywhere. Certainly far from sunny everywhere this evening. Quite a wet evening across North Wales, North West England. This is the radar showing rain into Northern Ireland and pushing into southern Scotland now too. That rain will be quite heavy for the next few hours, steadily easing off through the night. Across the south through the nights, quite a strong and gusty wind. Temperatures holding up into double figures across the south. Further north with clear skies, turning a little chilly across northwest Scotland, close to freezing here. That's all for now. Back to Louise.
Alex, thank you very much. And it's time to go back to Hugh. Afternoon again.
Yes, good afternoon once again. Welcome back to the BBC Election Centre. We're into the final hour of our live coverage of not just the results, of course, but the aftermath of this election. And we're talking now about the shape of the new cabinet. But as the names come in, and we're talking about Philip Hammond, and we're talking about Theresa May and George Osborne, so far, Jo Coburn, it looks remarkably similar.
Do you not think at this stage, when surprising all the critics, he's won an overall majority, he might have done something different with his top posts? I know he wants to thank and be loyal to his friends like George Osborne, but in a way, you might have expected something a bit more radical at this particular time when he would have the mandate to do it.
OK, but let's go straight to Downing Street. Norman Smith is there. Your thoughts, Norman, and what's been going on?
I feel cheated, Hugh. Here we are standing in the rain waiting for a reshuffle and nothing's happening. I think I've been led up the garden path. It seems all the key posts are staying as they were. What does it tell us? Well, I guess it tells us that Mr Cameron places a huge amount of importance on continuity. He clearly feels that on the crucial issue of renegotiating with Europe, Philip Hammond has the Eurosceptic credentials that will reassure many in his party who might have felt a bit queasy if someone less hardline on Europe had been put into that post. For Theresa May, I mean, being Home Secretary is, you know, commonly regarded as about the hardest job in government, because basically there are plenty of things to go wrong, whether it's prisons, terrorists, immigration, you name it, you've got the whole load coming at you. She's already done 5 years and she now has to soldier on. That is an awfully big task for her. But I think what we learned today is that Mr Cameron, above everything, values continuity. He does think there is merit in people understanding their briefs absolutely and completely and having a degree of continuity in policy so they can see things through. I think that is what we have to conclude.
Any thoughts on what Michael Fallon might be up to, Norman, at this stage? Because he's also gone in, hasn't he?
He went in with a military chap, and I expect he'll be coming out with a military chap. I presume he is going to remain at defence because it's hard to see where he goes or who would slot into his position. And based on the way things have worked so far, those are the only 4 people who've come up Downing Street. 3 of them have stayed in situ. So by that logic, I assume Michael Fallon will also stay in situ. Also, I think he is viewed as a very safe pair of hands in trying to diffuse what could be a very problematic area for Team Cameron, namely not being able to go ahead with a 2% defence cut. Mr Hammond, are you pleased to be staying at the Foreign Office? You'll be renegotiating with Europe. Well, Mr Hammond just walking through there to the Foreign Office saying yes, of course. He's glad to be staying at the Foreign Office, which just leaves Michael Fallon, door creaking open, but not Michael Fallon. I'm assuming Michael Fallon will also be staying in post.
OK, phenomenal. We'll be back straight away if there's something happening, but thanks very much. Andy, some thoughts here?
Well, we thought this was going to be a very, very exciting and fast-moving day with coalitions and parties getting together. It has proved a slightly duller day politically than that. And then we thought we were going to have a fantastically exciting reshuffle.
Yes.
I'm not sure if counts as a thought.
Could be other things.
Much worse than
OK. Well, Shirley Williams, it's good to have you with us. So let's have your thoughts on the reshuffle.
I've been bottling them up for a bit.
Yeah.
I think that the opportunity of the Prime Minister was to make a cabinet that was more reflective of opinion within his own party. Forget about the whole country. But you've got very striking Tories, what I might call one nation Tories, still active in the Conservative Party. Maybe we see more of them in the Lords. But we certainly see very remarkable, outstanding men and women in that category. I mean, one example would be someone like Lord Deben, for example, who was previously, as you know, a very distinguished Environment Secretary. Almost all of those don't seem to be likely to be part of the cabinet or even around it. Now, what that means is that the one nation Tories are essentially being pushed to the margins. And what this cabinet is, one that would deeply satisfy the 1922 committee. And what really frightens me, I mean, let's take one example, which is Philip Hammond. A very nice man, no doubt, and a good businessman. No record of his relationship to Europe being a constructive kind whatsoever. It all relates back to his own party. It does not relate to the needs of the European Union at a time when, for goodness sake, Russia is presenting a serious challenge, and what we're still doing is fiddling around with whether somebody is sceptic or not sceptic. So what really worries me is that I think the Prime Minister has essentially is reflecting the desperate attempt to try and hold his party together, but he's doing so by making almost all the concessions in one direction. One other remark, and then I might actually be quiet, but it's hard to keep it stopped. Some of the things that we ought to be talking about, let me give one example. Paris, the absolutely key environmental conference starting in October of this year. We've seen Ed Davey, who was an outstanding Environment Secretary, out of the picture. He had, as all three of you will know, a major commitment to very radical proposals for emissions being restricted and carbon use being restricted, really very far-reaching in housing, transport, elsewhere. He's gone. There's no indication that there's anybody coming up from the Conservative Party who's going to be able to run with the lead in that absolutely critical conference. So my worry is that some of the biggest issues in politics have not been discussed in the election and are not being reflected in the cabinet reshuffle.
We'll pick up on that. We're just seeing images, Shirley, of Michael Fallon leaving Downing Street now. And we have confirmation, do we, Jo?
We do. Watching him there leaving Downing Street, we can put up onto the screen from David Cameron. He says himself, my final appointment tonight is Michael Fallon as Defence Secretary. So there we have it. No change. No change at all at the top. Just to pick up on what Shirley Williams was saying about you think this is a cabinet that is moving even further to the right, although it's the same, they are the same figures, if you like, that were there before. There we have Philip Hammond's press card. There he is, continuing as Foreign Secretary. And we've also got some reaction, further reaction from the European Union. Jean-Claude Juncker has been quick off the mark. Congratulations. He's the president of the EU Commission. He'll be very important in those negotiations, of course. There he is saying, I'm ready to work with you to strike a fair deal for the UK, because that is going to be a key battleground now in the months ahead for this government, for those on the negotiating team and from the European Union. It sounds like they're already reaching out.
Well,
you say
maybe.
there's no connection between the two.
He was also the person who was offended by the Prime Minister making quite clear he would not actually work with him. And that story goes on, and I know the EU very well. And what's going on is a feeling that the United Kingdom wants to marginalise itself and that it is not putting forward constructive proposals in the negotiations, only constructive proposals with regard to the interests of Britain.
Although David Cameron wants to stay in. I mean, that's what he says. He wants his campaign to stay in, so he will be trying to put something
himself, I fear.
This is going to be painful, Shirley, but I want you to look at some of the images we have here, because these are the people who are no longer in the House of Commons from the Lib Dems. And there we have Vince Cable as Business Secretary in the last Parliament. Ed Davey, you've just mentioned him and the work he put in energy. And we have Simon Hughes, who's been in Southwark for, well, since the early 80s. And if we move on, Charles Kennedy, former party leader. David Laws, who, of course, served in the Treasury and then in Schools Minister. We have Danny Alexander, former Chief Secretary. There are more to come. Lynn Featherstone, Joe Swinson, two very prominent Lib Dems in the last Parliament again. And then I think, you know, we could go on, but But I'm just going to ask you the basic question, which is, did anyone in the party foresee that this degree of, and I'm going to use the word punishment, by voters would be meted out in this way?
No, I think your phrase is completely right, Hugh, when you say the word this degree. We all thought there would be losses. We thought that probably we'd lose about a third of our MPs. We didn't think we'd lose almost all of them. And what's tragic to me, and it would also include, incidentally, some outstanding politicians in other parties. I mean, an obvious example is Jim Murphy of the Labour Party. Some of the finest people in politics have been cussed out, what they used to call the cutting down to the highest puppies. That's what's happening. And as a result, our politics, which God knows the media have made it plain, is pretty miserable anyway, is going to be still further diminished in terms of quality and courage. It doesn't seem to serve one very much to show courage. And I think people like Jim Murphy, who've shown astonishing courage and are now out, and people like, for example, I can give other examples too, who are out, it shows something very sad about the reasons why voters do or don't get rid of somebody. Finally, let me say that our basic principle was that some of the outstanding men and women who are terribly admired in their constituency would hang on. Well, two have. One is, of course, North Norfolk, the shape of Mr. Lamb, Mr. Norman Lamb, who's the Minister of Health, and the other one is the Member of Parliament for the Lake District, Tim Farron, who is loved and adored there. But that's all, and I can give case after case, like Wells and others, of brilliant Lib Dem MPs, and actually some brilliant other MPs, where it hasn't made the difference it should have made in a deeply cynical society.
OK, well, isn't this more to the point because your party was seen by its voters and many of its members being essentially a left-of-centre party who cannot stick you going into government with the Conservatives, and after the coalition, you couldn't really come out in the election campaign and defend everything the government was doing because you were also attacking the Tories, with whom you had been working so closely. And that deeply confused voters and angered them all across the country.
Well, the trouble was, you see, once you'd entered into coalition, you had to be loyal to the coalition until such time as there no longer was a coalition. You may remember the period between the two was about 10 days, because the coalition ended just in time for us to get going. I take your point, but I'll make one other point, which has not been touched upon, as far as I know, by the BBC, really, almost at all. Sorry, it's very controversial. We haven't mentioned the fact that in places like Twickenham, in places like Sutton, in places like Kingston upon Thames and other places like Simons, the amount of money poured in by the other two parties was in the thousands and upon thousands. Once the sort election came, we had the usual regulation. But one of the huge mistakes, and I'll share the Lib Dem responsibility for it also, was that when we changed to a 5-year fixed-term parliament, we didn't adjust the financial regulations to cover a period of something like 6 months. And as a result, we're beginning to drift towards the American system, where, to put it bluntly, and you know I was at Harvard for 10 years, as Professor of Elected Politics, we now see democracy for sale.
OK, let's pause.
It's coming close here now.
Thank you, Shirley, for making the point. Let's pause there for a second. I think Andrew Neil has some guests at Westminster.
Yes, Hugh, we do. Thank you very much. I was listening to your conversation with John Curtis. Can I just say that Professor John Curtis is a genius, and his exit polls in 2010 and 2015 were works of accuracy, art and authority. I take my hat off to him. It's quite amazing. More importantly, I can announce that Paddy Ashdown's hacked Twitter account now has 12,300 followers, which is more than some of the smaller parties that I interviewed during this election campaign. Anyway, we're joined by Graham Brady. He's chairman of the 1922 committee, which means he's the kind of shop steward for Tory backbenchers. Matthew Parris, esteemed, famous, legendary columnist and commentator, who sometimes gets it right, but not always. And Wes Streeter, who is a Labour MP, who had quite a new Labour MP from Ilford North. Streeting, sorry.
Yeah,
Streeting.
I was about to say, I'm a new boy, but it's Streeting.
No, you are new, but I won't forget that now. Streeting. And you actually had a sizable swing to you to become MP. Let me start with Graham Brady. You saw the Prime Minister today. Are you joining the government?
I've not been made Foreign Secretary or Chancellor. I think you can see that from the announcements already.
Any other job?
No, well, I was very pleased that he called me in very early to discuss how we can work most effectively and make sure that the party is as well included as possible in the policy process and in making sure that the thin majority that we have, very welcome, but a very, very small majority, can function effectively in government.
In your view, should he bolster that majority by coming to some kind of arrangement with the DUP from Northern Ireland?
I think it's worth having discussions where they don't compromise what we wish to do, what we believe in, what was set out in manifesto promises. But I don't think we're bound to do it. I think we can operate without any formal agreement.
And do you think that the Prime Minister is apprehensive as he begins this difficult process of renegotiating our terms of entry in the terms of membership of the European Union, that he could get a lot of trouble from what I might call a modern version of the Maastricht rebels?
I think that we are almost all pointing in the same direction. We'd like to make progress towards a more flexible, more trade-focused European Union. So I hope there's a good deal that can be achieved in that direction. Obviously, the more we're able to focus and work together, the more we're going to achieve.
He should have made you Foreign Secretary, because that was an incredibly diplomatic reply, wasn't it, Matthew Paris?
Yes.
How much trouble is the Prime Minister in for?
I think not a lot for a little while. I think he goes into this new government with an enormous amount of confidence and moral authority. He's surprised everybody. I think the right are going to be a little bit, or the anti-European right, a little bit quiescent for a while. Not all of them have come back at this election. Some have retired. Who can look further than about a year ahead? But I wouldn't be expecting any major bust-ups this summer.
Is it not the case that there's quite a sizable chunk of the Conservative backbenches who are what you could describe pretty insatiable on this issue? That the Prime Minister will be unable to deliver anything like the repatriation of powers that they want?
I think the peak of that mood has passed. I think it's unlikely the Prime Minister will be able to bring back anything that pleases everybody, but I think the mood for a rebellion over this has probably passed. It may come back again, but I don't know, is it your view?
What's critically important, Andrew, is that we are pledged to deliver the referendum. So if people aren't happy with what is renegotiated, they are at liberty to campaign for an out vote.
Yes.
And that's something that we as a country can settle.
And that's true for the country, but isn't there a danger for the Conservative Party that if he doesn't get too much to bring back to change, but says, I still think we should vote to stay in, that splits your party almost to a degree the way the Corn Law reforms split the Peel Conservative Party in the 19th century?
I think that sometimes the more you try to apply pressure and prevent a degree of independence on these issues, the more the danger of a split. I think if we simply accept there is a broad spectrum of views on this issue, mostly we want to go in the same direction, some would like to go much further than others, we'll make the progress that we can make, and we do know that we and the British people will be able to exercise their opinion at the end of the process.
Wes Streeting, why did you do much better than many of your colleagues in the south of England? You're Ilford North, on the edges of London, towards Essex, on the border with Essex, I think. And outside London, Labour did well in London, but outside London, it wasn't a very happy day for your party.
No.
What did you do that your colleagues didn't?
Well, I think we need to spend a lot of time actually debating why Labour did so badly across the country. And my sense from talking to some of my colleagues across the country is that I think there are different factors at play in different parts of the country. And I think we have not just the north-south divide, but an increasingly splintered country in terms of the different issues that certainly Labour candidates were facing. I think in Ilford North we had the advantage of a really good ground campaign. I had hundreds of campaigners out yesterday. The Conservatives had dozens.
But the Labour was claiming it had a great ground campaign everywhere. We heard that endlessly. We've got the better ground campaign. It worked with you. It didn't work in lots of other places.
I think the interesting thing about my constituency is that you're right, it's that commuter belt, London-Essex border. It's people who've moved out from places like Tower Hamlets because they want bigger homes and get their kids into good schools. It's aspirational, ambitious. I'm a Tower Hamlets boy myself. I was born on a council estate, and a big part of my campaign was about my personal story, saying, look, here's where I've come from in life, and I believe that, you know, the reason why you should vote for me as a Labour candidate is because we want everyone, whatever your background, to have the same chances in life, and I think that really resonated with lots of the people that I'll now be representing.
OK, well, good to meet one of the new intake today. Hugh, I'm handing back to you. This is our final hit from Westminster. here. This is our 20th hour of non-stop broadcasting. I've got to go now and do a radio show for Radio 5 Live. It's live from 7 to 8 tonight on Radio 5 Live. I'll leave you without me, Hugh, but somehow I feel you will just manage to muddle through.
Well, the innocents abroad will think that you're going to have a little kip, Andrew, but all of us know that you're incapable of doing that.
This is
so
true.
we salute your energy, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Hugh.
Andrew Neil with guests at
He doesn't need any
Westminster.
sleep, you know that.
He doesn't need sleep. He doesn't need sleep at all. We know he doesn't. Not even 3 hours a night. So that's it. That's the Andrew Neil miracle for you. So we've been talking, of course, about the revolution, really, that's happened in terms of Scottish representation at Westminster. Laura Bicker, our correspondent, is in Glasgow. And Laura, just some thoughts from you on how that's been sort of accepted there today, how that's been received there, and what's been the response to it? Oh, dear. I don't think we've got Laura, have we? No. OK, well, let's try. Shall we try and bring Laura back again? Because it's... I can tell you now, let you into a secret, Laura's been waiting to talk to us for quite a long time.
Oh.
So it's a shame that the sound wasn't there. I am delighted to say, though, that we've been joined in the studio by the former Foreign Secretary and former Conservative Home Secretary, Lord Hurd. Thank you so much for coming in, Lord Hurd. Nice to see you. Let's begin by talking to you about what's happened overnight. And for you, what are the main reasons for this remarkable turnaround for the Conservative Party?
This is the third time in my political lifetime that a Tory party, not favoured, behindhand in the opinion polls, has swept to victory to everyone's surprise. Ted Heath, 1970, John Major, 1992, and now David Cameron, 1995. It's a remarkable thing. And maybe just tell us something about a sort of underlying pull towards the Conservatives, really regardless of the issues.
Why would that be? Well, this time, especially after a period of coalition government, why would that be?
People like to hang on to what they know. And some of them, of course, say, let's do away with the rascals. But I think outweighing that is the sort of feeling, well, David Cameron's done a good job. He's done his best, looks right. We'd be taking too big a risk with Ed Miliband.
Could I?
Yes, Andy.
I was just wondering whether Lord Hurd thought, therefore, that England is proving itself more and more a conservative country, while Scotland is going the other way. And, of course, we know that we're talking to the co-author of Scotch on the Rocks, the thriller about the Scottish nationalist breakaway back in the 1970s.
It's not a bad book.
Not a bad... I didn't say it was a bad book. It's a very good book.
No, it's good. And one of the main devotees of Scotch on the Rocks is Salmond. He's spoken to me often about it. Well, the English are odd, and maybe this feeling of an underlying pull towards the Conservatives, which goes on regardless of issues, regardless of personalities, really. It's just there. And in the last minute or two of the whole thing, it pulls the electorate just that little bit, not hugely, just that little bit to the right.
But Douglas Hurd...
I think, Joe, sorry, I think we've made contact with Laura Bicker again, have we?
Go ahead.
I hope we have anyway.
Oh.
So this time, Laura, you're going to tell me, I hope we're going to hear you telling us about the response to that remarkable result overnight, and tell us about it.
Well, I was at the Emirates Arena in Glasgow last night as they were finishing up the Glasgow count, and the mood was just exuberant from the SNP, and yet many of the activists, many of them I've met throughout the referendum, throughout my travels right across Scotland, and when I spoke to them, they just simply could not believe what they were seeing. Even when the exit poll came out, I know you had a gasp in the studio, we were certainly the same where we were, and I think It's been predicted. In fact, way back last October, it was predicted in the polls that the SNP could wipe Labour away from Scotland, and yet many predicted it. Few actually believed it. We thought the personalities like Douglas Alexander, like Jim Murphy, and for the Liberal Democrats, Danny Alexander, Michael Moore, Charles Kennedy, we thought these personalities and their profile would perhaps override the SNP tide, but they just couldn't do it. And certainly last night we watched scalp after scalp after scalp. It was quite extraordinary. And I think certainly this morning there are a number of people within the SNP who are still coming to terms with that victory, and they're still trying to figure out what it might mean, especially since they will be on the opposition benches. I think there was a hope that the Labour would win through in some way and form a minority government, and that they would be able to hold Labour's feet to the fire. But certainly from the opposition benches, they'll have to see what they can do.
And just a thought on how Scottish Labour turns itself around, or tries to at least, Laura, looking ahead to the Scottish parliamentary elections, which are taking place next year. It's just a year, and it'll go very quickly in political terms. Your thoughts there on the state of Labour in Scotland?
Scottish Labour really have a mountain to climb. This has been a long time coming, and we should maybe have seen the writing on the wall. Way back when it was New Labour and they took us into the Iraq war, there were certainly people in Scotland that did not agree with that. Then fast forward to 2011, the Holyrood elections, and we sat back and we watched and we saw the SNP sweep through, in fact with quite a high percentage of the vote. Again, something we weren't quite sure would actually happen. And at that time we looked at Scottish Labour and we thought, well, they'll still do okay when it comes to the Westminster election. But then we had the independence referendum, and what that has done is changed the mindset in Scotland. It's made people in Scotland think, what can or what should Westminster be doing for them? And that way they've changed their vote. They've listened to a party that has put out this message that they say they will fight for Scotland, and that has been the SNP and not Labour. What Scottish Labour have to do now, and they have still got Jim Murphy as leader, they have to rally round and they have to look at what the message they're giving across to people in Scotland. It may mean that they have to become more distinctively Scottish. Having one message south of the border and one message north of the border is maybe the only way that they will be able to make progress coming into the 2016 Scottish elections. They have to be unique and they have to be different. The same message will not work for Middle England as for Scotland, and I think certainly they're going to have to look at the offer that they're giving in the Scottish Parliament. I think the other thing is, the architects of devolution were Scottish Labour. You're looking at people like Donald Dewar. He was one of the people that took devolution and brought it here to Scotland. Now, when it comes to something like that, Labour should have taken it and run with it, and they didn't. They have been accused of fielding a B team north of the border and fielding their A team in Westminster, and certainly Scottish people will see through that. They have to look at the talent they've got in Holyrood, and they have to work on it, and they certainly have to make them look electable to the Scottish public. Can they do that in a year? We'll just have to wait and see.
OK, Laura, thanks very much again. Laura Bicker there for us in Glasgow with her thoughts on the well, the very interesting, to say the least, aftermath of the campaign there in Scotland. So, it's just turned 5:35 here, and we're at the BBC Election Centre. Last 20 minutes or so of our coverage, going back many hours. Jeremy Vine has been here all along, and here he is with his story of what's happened. Jeremy.
We thought the first time we saw this virtual Downing Street that we would be telling a story of both the main parties in the UK, Labour and the Conservatives, failing to get to the line here. 326 seats needed to reach the line and send your leader through the door. But the Conservatives have done it, and let's see how they paved that path to Downing Street by looking at the seats they won. So we bring them down Downing Street here, right up to the line. Let's have a look at some of these. We have ordered them in the order of the closeness of the results, so the tightness or marginality, as the experts would say. And therefore, some of these were marginal and aren't anymore. So Broxtowe, where Anna Soubry is the minister, the Conservatives could have lost that. They actually strengthened their position there. Hendon, the same there in London. Sutton and Cheam, a seat they took from the Lib Dems. Then we have this really interesting triangle of seats here. Just a triangle in the sense that they're all in the same place in the path. Thanet South, where Nigel Farage stood and lost. Southampton, Itchen, again from Labour. And there was not just that, there were several of them. Warwickshire North. Now, Warwickshire North was fascinating because that was a seat the Conservatives won by just a handful of votes in 2010. And they took it back tonight. Labour should have swept through that, no trouble. St Ives over here, the last seat to declare. What else have we got? Lincoln, Carl McCartney MP, staying in the House of Commons. Bedford, Richard Fuller MP, staying in the House of Commons. Telford, Plymouth Moor View, Alison Seaback, gains from Labour. And then the Portillo moment here in Morley and Outwood. Very marginal now, but my goodness, the Conservatives won it and knocked the shadow Chancellor out of Parliament. And they also here, I mean, it was very tight, you can see, because these are the tightest seats here at the end, the tightest results. Vale of Clwyd and Gower in Wales, they took as well. So that is how they crossed the line. And these are the new marginals. I've been learning marginals the last couple of months. Lots of people on the team have done. I've been carrying this list around. That list goes now. We have a list of new marginals here. At the end of this line, we see the Labour line as well, and you can see how far back they fell. 232 Labour seats, almost 100 seats behind the Conservatives. What a remarkable story. So we went into this election with one battleground, we've emerged with another. Who knows what happens with Morley and Gower and the Vale of Clwyd in 5 years' time. But for now, the Conservatives have definitively crossed the line. And the great thing for me about this election result is that it shows that the power is not in the hands of the pollsters or even the politicians. It's with the people. It's with you when you voted. Hugh.
And the moment, Jeremy, that will stand out for you overnight or during today, which moment was that? Was it Ed Balls losing his seat, or what was the moment?
I'll give you a slightly obscure moment, but because we work with the graphics here in the battlegrounds, we were focused always on Warwickshire North, because it was won by 54 votes by the Conservatives last time, battling Gordon Brown, and you assumed that Labour would go straight through that like a knife through butter. And when that seat stayed blue, right at the top of Labour's target list, we just thought, something here is happening that is utterly unpredicted.
That was the one, quite
that
right.
was the one.
Absolutely, yeah, that was the moment.
It's been great to have you with us, Jeremy. Thank
Thanks
you so much
much.
again.
Amazing,
for
amazing
bringing
to be
such
part of
energy and life to it. It's been great. Thank you very much. Jeremy Vine there, and we can release him now from the dark Downing Street, although it nearly is dark again in Downing Street by the time he's finished. Let's go to Downing Street now, because Ben Wright is there for us. And Ben, let's have a quick word with Ben about the comings and goings, because we've been talking about the limited reshuffle so far, Ben, but what are your thoughts this evening?
Well, after the extraordinary events of the last 24 hours, it's been a strange hour of calm here, and it's looked as if everything has remained the same. Of course, it hasn't, but we saw 4 key cabinet ministers turn up here in Downing Street, go into number 10, to be reappointed into the jobs they had before the general election. So George Osborne stays at the Treasury, Michael Fallon stays at Defence, Philip Hammond stays as Foreign Secretary, and Theresa May stays at the Home Office. So it's a mark of continuity, but of course there will be a bigger reshuffle further down the line, we're quite certain, because, of course, freed from coalition, David Cameron will appoint only from the Conservative Party, and there are holes to fill in. Seats that used to be occupied by Liberal Democrat cabinet ministers, Vince Cable, Danny Alexander, for instance. Those need to be filled. And there are many Conservatives, I think, who've waited patiently for 5 years with growing frustration in some cases, wanting jobs, wanting to advance on the ministerial ladder. They haven't been able to because power is shared between 2 parties. I think there'll be many people now looking for some reward. But that now is entirely in David Cameron's hand as the leader of a majority Conservative government.
Well, indeed, Ben. And just a thought as well, because we're now in the very early stages of a leadership contest in the Labour Party, the Liberal Democratic Party, and, of course, in UKIP as well. So all of those 3 parties thrown into turmoil.
Yeah, I mean, an extraordinary day for those 2 leaders, certainly Nick Clegg and Ed Miliband, to be dispatched as swiftly as they have been, and huge existential strategic questions for both parties about how on earth they recover from this. And as you've been hearing from Laura, I think particularly Labour, destroyed in their heartlands in Scotland, terrible state of affairs in England. How do they rebuild? What do they say? And who is the figure that might lead them out of this terribly difficult dead end that they have suddenly found themselves in, with a huge mountain to climb? But certainly, compared to where he was 24 hours ago, David Cameron will be feeling that this was entirely unpredictable. He did not have any confidence that he would be here tonight appointing those 4 people back into the cabinet post they had before. We were all expecting a haggle, a wrangle, a long negotiation. None of that happened.
Ben, for now, thanks very much. And Joe?
Yes, just picking up on that, Douglas Hurd. I mean, David Cameron has said, we will govern as one nation. But how can he do that when the SNP have totally taken over Scotland, or pretty well, and he was accused, and the Tories were accused of stoking English nationalism during this campaign?
Well, what David Cameron was doing was drawing attention to the fact that there are different parts of the United Kingdom, and much the biggest is England. And by drawing attention to that, he's not offending anybody, or shouldn't be offending anybody. It's only the Scots who have this peculiar feeling, I think. Going back to your earlier thought, I don't want to be rude about the Scottish Labour MPs, but they are not the pick of the bunch.
He said, probably being rude.
We see some of them turn up in the House of Lords, of course, and so they're perfectly nice, some of them, but they haven't really got the guts to
Damning with faint praise there, I feel, Douglas Hurd.
So we established earlier on that the English were odd, and now we know that the Scots are peculiar, which I think is a kind of the definitive answer.
Yeah. Let's pause there. Emily, I know you've got some interesting things to tell us right at the end of this day, because you too have been in a position where you've explained so much to us overnight and during the day. It's been great. The screen, actually, has worked brilliantly. So just take us through some of the last few seats you want to talk about, and then maybe I'll ask you for a moment as well.
It was interesting hearing Ben just talk about the existential questions that the Lib Dems are going to ask themselves now. And the problem is there aren't that many of them left. What I want to show you now is the 8 remaining Lib Dem MPs. It's the same number of DUP MPs there are. And when you look at it like this, you realise how solitary that party now looks. We used to talk about strongholds, the southwest or the big northern part of Scotland. Now they're spread out. You've got one, Alistair Carmichael, still in Orkney and Shetland here. He held on. Let's just go through them very quickly and see where we're talking about. An amazing result still for Tim Farron. He has an extraordinary personal vote which held up for him in Westmoreland and Lonsdale, the Lake District in the northwest. The same sort of thing in Southport here. Much lesser known John Pugh, but he held on in that same region. And then we're across the other side, Leeds northwest, Yorkshire and Humber. One held on here. Nick Clegg, a greatly reduced majority, down to 2,300, but he held on in Sheffield Hallam. And I can show you the rest. Ceredigion, 1 seat in Wales there. 1 seat, Norman Lamb in Norfolk North. And this final one is Tom Brake, who's the only London Lib Dem MP. You can see just how scattered they are now. When we're looking to see the territory, you know, the safe territory that we used to talk about, it's just not there.
As you say, pretty well wiped out in London, then. That was the only hold.
Wiped out in London, wiped out in the southwest. All those battles that we used to look at have gone.
And no female MPs left.
And no female MPs, yeah.
Is there a moment, Emily? Is there a moment which you'll take away with you as being the kind of turning point, or...?
Well, I guess there were 2 moments. One was a face, and it was the face of Simon Hughes when he lost his seat in Bermondsey, because he's been such a part of the architecture there. He's been an MP since 1983, and it was very tricky seeing some of those long-held seats and the histories that went with them go. And I guess, cephalogically, if I'm allowed one, my Basildon moment would be Nuneaton. That was the point that came about 10-2, and it was very similar to the 1992 moment at Basildon, when we suddenly thought, hang on a sec, this is not going Labour's way, it is going the Tories' way. This could start to look like a majority, and I think that was the moment it clicked for many of us here. And
the really unfair question, when the exit poll was unveiled last night, what was your immediate thought?
I think I hid under the desk.
I think we all hid under the desk. And another thought, Andy, is when you go through that list of names, I realise, is there anyone left for you to interview from the Lib Dems on a Sunday morning or not?
It's going to be a bit tricky, I have to say that. It'll be Tim Farron every single week.
Yeah.
No, it's going to be... And Norman Lamb. Norman Lamb was a very, very successful health minister, much respected for his work on mental health in particular. Yeah. He's a serious character.
Emily, on a much more serious note, thank you so much for bringing it all to life for us and for illustrating so energetically for us and in such a vivid way what's been going on. It's been great. Thank you very much. Emily Maitlis there. So, a few closing thoughts as we approach 6 o'clock, and I suppose I'll come to Andy in a second. I suppose, Joe, first of all, from our point of view in terms of the run of the campaign and where we are today, and given the fact that you, interestingly, spent the night in Thanet in Kent, your thoughts on how the campaign developed and whether we could now, in retrospect, pick out little bits of the campaign which might have pointed to today?
I'm not sure whether we could have done that. I mean, the campaign for me was too long. Not just for me personally, I mean in terms of coverage. It was very long. It didn't really move because we were looking at the polls as they were happening. The fact that they hadn't picked up that there was going to be some sort of surge for the Tories or that the Liberal Democrats were going to be wiped out, it is by the by. But the campaign was tightly managed. You'll have heard that already, which meant we didn't get much of a sense beyond what was being shown to us by the main campaigns. There were two things that struck me. As you say, I was in Thanet South with Nigel Farage. The Tories, Lord Hurd will remember, that was the big fear a year ago. That was their big fear, was that UKIP were going to take a lot of seats away from the Tories. It didn't materialise. Yes, I take that they came second in lots of places. They actually troubled Labour in the north. But that was one facet that, in the end, Nicola Sturgeon became the insurgent. She set the campaign alight.
She certainly did, but thinking of what Lord Hurd was saying about that last-minute move, my heretical thought of the day and the evening is, heretical. Did the campaign actually matter? All that effort, all that money, all that crisscrossing of the country, in the end, did it make a blind bit of difference?
Well,
I think it does, yes.
Yes, you do, Lord Hurd?
Yes, I think it does. I mean, having done it myself for a number of years, it's good therapy for the candidate. That's one thing. It bucks him up when he goes and knocks on the door and is received in a friendly way. But it's very hard if you lose because it's so public.
Of course.
And it's so personal. They're just saying, you're not as good as that lady down the line or that man down the line.
Yeah.
And that makes it a different kind of contest from most of the things. And I think we should spare, if not a tear, at least a thought for the casualties.
It's a good point. It's a good point to be made.
Of course, the campaign will always happen. No one could stop it happening. I'm just thinking, we started right at the beginning with the sense that Labour were a bit behind, David Cameron's a bit ahead, and after all the hullabaloo, that's exactly where we ended up, and that the Liberal Democrats were in trouble.
Can I just bring you to a tweet from David Miliband, Ed Miliband's brother. Obviously, we might be able to show it up on the screen here. This, of course, no, we're not able to see it, but heart goes out to great colleagues who lost seats, Labour teams who worked so hard, and, of course, to Ed Miliband. Well, make of that what you will. Of course, it is a reminder of that contest between the two brothers. It then became a feature of this campaign because you remember Michael Fallon accused Ed Miliband if he was able to stab his brother in the back, then he'd be able to stab the country in the back over defence. Well, this is from David Miliband.
And I have to say, again, picking up from Lord Hurd, thinking of the speeches made by Douglas Alexander and Jim Murphy in defeat, and many, many others. We may be bad at lots of things in this country, but at least we're still a nation of good losers.
A final thought, Andrew, because lots of people have been tweeting and making remarks about the run now to this referendum on our relationship with the European Union. So with Labour in a leadership turmoil and the Lib Dems too, where Nick Clegg could have been expected to take a certain line on this, and Lib Dems now greatly weakened, where is the opposing argument going to come from here? Is it from the SNP or who's it from?
It'll come from the opposition MPs, but they'll be scattered. And it's not always an advantage to have a poor and divided opposition. Sometimes you need somebody to fight against. And that may be David Cameron's big problem. That if there isn't a big fight coming from the outside of the Tory party provides it internally, as it has done so many times in the past.
And just very briefly, Lord Hurd, is that one of your main concerns now, that as we look forward to this referendum on the EU, that could provide its own share of turmoil once again in the Conservative Party?
It will, to a certain extent, but I just think we've got past that point. I don't myself believe that there's a great army of sceptics longing to be up and at 'em, whose energies will be released by the referendum. There will be. It'll be a tough fight. I think myself that a yes vote, properly conducted, would win. But I can't prove that, and it'll be a tough fight, and it should be a tough fight. It's a big decision.
Joe, what, in your view, has changed from the mid-90s when Lord Hurd was in government and the group of Tory MPs today who apparently are not going to be as troublesome.
I'm not sure I agree with Douglas Hurd on that point. Douglas Hurd will know only full well and remember what it was like, that period of instability. You know, we've talked about the fact that 1992, and it wasn't expected, John Major was returned, he had that majority, and then he was frustrated all the way along by Europe, and that infighting over which you were there happened all the way through his reign. That could happen, maybe to a lesser extent, but that could still happen because there are Eurosceptics in the Conservative Party. We'd like to see the party come out.
The Conservative Party today is much, much more united, but it's much more united on a stronger, more Eurosceptic position. So that negotiation has to go well for David Cameron and the government.
Final thought, Andy. What's going through David Cameron's mind tonight in Downing Street? Apart from the fact that he's exhausted after a long campaign.
Just flooded with relief, because I started the evening with David Cameron just outside his house, not with him personally, but outside his house in Witney, surrounded by lots of Conservatives who are friends and allies of his and so forth. And I have to say, I think he was very, very worried. One picked up a real sense of unease and alarm. I think George Osborne knew what was going on, but I'm not sure that David Cameron did. When that exit poll came out, it was like an explosion. I mean, the relief and the turnaround, the kind of emotional turnaround was absolutely extraordinary.
Can I just say on that note, I mean, we talk to politicians all the time. I think one of my colleagues did speak to George Osborne literally the day before, on the Wednesday, and he was confident. He was confident at that stage, perhaps more than we'd seen for any of the other senior Tories, that actually, not that they were going to do as well as they have done, but they were going to definitely be the largest party by a significant number. Linton Crosby, the strategist who worked for the Conservatives, the Australian, who was criticised for not running a good enough campaign, well, of course, he'll feel completely vindicated. He said, we're going to get 300-plus seats.
Joe, thank you very much. Thanks for being with us. Lord Hurd, thanks for being with us. Andy, great to have you with us. Thank you very much.
Very nice. Thank you.
We're coming to the end of the programme. On a day and a night that's been remarkable in its drama and its sheer unpredictability. David Cameron, against all the predictions of the polls, has led his party to an outright victory. The Conservatives are now back in government with a majority of 12. 3 opposition leaders, Ed Miliband, Nigel Farage, Nick Clegg, have resigned, and the Lib Dems suffering huge losses throughout the country. And, of course, Nicola Sturgeon's SNP has swept to power across Scotland. It's been a great privilege to bring you the twists and turns of the past 20 hours. We'll leave you now with this reflection on the key moments of the 2015 general election. Goodbye.
This election must count as one of the most fascinating, unpredictable ever.
Tonight, we'll see how near the winner of this election could get to the very door.
We will relay it and see how much the power balance has shifted.
Quite remarkable, this exit poll. The Conservatives on 316.
And it leaves us poised for a fascinating night.
Mary Black, Scottish National Party, 23,548.
Kirsten Francis Oswald, Scottish National Party, 23,030.
This is, of course, an enormous moment for the SNP, and no one can deny that.
The people of Scotland are speaking, and it is time for their voice to be heard at Westminster.
The Scottish lion has roared.
Any government that emerges at Westminster has to pay heed to what has happened in Scotland today.
Labour take that seat from the Liberal Democrats. You can see it on Simon Hughes' face.
What a night. What a night.
Vince Cable, the business secretary, defeated in Twickenham.
This has been a cruel and punishing night for the Liberal Democrats. The election has profound implications for the country. It also obviously has profound implications for the Liberal Democrats.
Well, it would be fair to say it was a brutal campaign.
But when you go into it, you know it's going to be brutal. I mean, it's never an easy ride, is it?
This has clearly been a very disappointing and difficult night, and I'm deeply sorry for what has happened.
16,692.
And I hereby declare that the said Boris Johnson is duly elected.
Cameron, David William Donald, the Conservative Party candidate, 35,201.
I will make sure I do not let you down.
I'm confident Labour will be back.
This general election has produced quite a remarkable story.
It will be a leadership election for the next leader of UKIP. I will consider whether to put my name forward to do that job again.
I must take responsibility, and therefore I announce that I will be resigning as leader of the Liberal Democrats.
Britain needs a Labour Party that can rebuild after this defeat, so I'm tendering my resignation. The fight goes on.
The official result of this general election is a majority win for the Conservatives.
I've just been to see Her Majesty the Queen, and I will now form a majority Conservative government. We will govern as a party of one nation, one united kingdom. I truly believe we're on the brink of something special in our country.
It's a Spanish Grand Prix.